All right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I have an extra special treat, not just a special treat, but an extra special treat. It's something that I personally have been looking forward to the most. Apart from like big name guests, those shows are great. But this is really the type of show that's the most important to me because I'm going to be finishing up my Cosmological Argument. I did that long series of solo shows where I lay out my reasoning. Why do I believe in God? And I gave my cosmological argument as one of those reasons in that cumulative case. And now we get to kind of seal the deal. We get to kind of finish that off in more of a summary type show format. And I get to hear the take of my Christian friend, David Russell. So David, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dale, thanks for having me on, man.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me as my Christian support and buddy here.
No problem, bud.
Awesome. And I'm also really grateful because it's really important to me to get an atheist take. And we have one of the best. We have Rich Harkness, who goes by the alias Vaal for those. Welcome to the show, Vaal, or Rich.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks very much, Dale.
Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, I think with that said, let's get straight into the show. And first thing I want to do, Rich, because this is kind of your first time on my show officially as a guest, why don't you kind of introduce the audience as to who you are, maybe explain your faith journey, just kind of interested where you came from.
Okay, sure. Once again, my name is Rich, and I am, it's not like I'm published anywhere or anything like that. I'm really just an atheist who's sort of been in the trenches on and off for quite a few years, sort of discussing these issues with my fellow atheists and with believers, etc. And just a quick nutshell, I guess, of where I was coming from is that I actually did have a little bit of churching when I was younger, where my mom, who's always been something of a Christian light, she'll put the manger statues, that kind of stuff at Christmas, but puts it away for the rest of the year. But she wanted us to have some attachment to Christianity, that is myself and my brother. And there happened to be a church on our street. And so she said, oh, well, send them to church. So we went to church, and it turned out this church was more in the hellfire breathing, preaching, apocalyptic kind of church. It was very heavy duty. And I remember, and this is my first sort of encounter with religion, right? I've talked about this with my brother, is that there was always something that felt off about the whole thing. Everybody always had this sort of exaggerated smile, it seemed. And there was always a sense, it wasn't like going to school. There's always a sense like they were trying to convince you in something. Not that they were teaching you something, but they were against, they're going to convince you of this no matter what, kind of thing. And I remember the sort of breaking point to me was when one of the pastors had taken a few of us young people aside. I was describing this incident where I think he was at a party and evolution came up, and then he sort of told us, and I was absolutely insulted by the suggestion that I'm actually related to a monkey or to any. That is the most disgusting insult I can imagine. Aren't you insulted by that? And I'm like, I was into science and evolution, all that kind of stuff, even as a young person, and I'm thinking like, but we are. I was just like baffled. I was like, why is this adult who I'm supposed to be learning with seemingly ignorant of things? I went home, I said, Mom, this is what's happening at Sunday school. And she's like, oh, I'm taking you out, kind of stuff. So that they also, since they breathed the hellfire in too, that left a sort of fear in me for a while too. It lasted. That was not fun. But beyond that, I just forgot it and had no scars from religion or anything against it and like that, but it just became something I just didn't even think about. Then I moved from being very interested in science, et cetera, and nature. I moved into the skeptical literature, investigating all sorts of different claims of the paranormal, Bigfoot, and all that kind of stuff, and found the skeptical case against all these more and more compelling. So I moved out of possible belief in those things to like being very skeptical of them. And then I realized sort of religion was left over, and I thought that just doesn't seem very plausible to me, but there sure are a lot of people who believe it, and a lot of really smart people. So I should really take a look at why people believe this. Maybe I've missed something. So I sort of put my nose into the philosophy, that kind of stuff, for quite a while. I was more in my 20s, and I came out at the end of that still a non-believer, and after that entered, I guess, lots of sort of dialogues with believers on and off throughout the years, and so that's where I am now, I guess.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was interesting, because I've never asked you that before about your background. So that was great to kind of learn about that. So awesome. All right. With that said, let's get straight into the cosmological argument. And the first thing I want to do is kind of ask you guys about your take in general about cosmological arguments. So I kind of laid it out in my part 1 video, that there are three types of cosmological arguments. So in the first place, we're all familiar with the Kalam cosmological argument of Dr. William Lane Craig, where argues that the universe began to exist. Everything that begins to exist needs a cause. So that's known as a Kalam cosmological argument. There's also Thomistic cosmological arguments. I know David Russell, he likes that. I think you mentioned Trent Horn on that front. So things like a prime mover to explain all motion in the universe, stuff like that. And then there's the Leibnizian cosmological argument, or otherwise the argument from the contingency of the universe, which is the type that I went for here. So yeah, I just want to kind of throw it open to you guys. What's your take on cosmological arguments in general? Do you think one type is better than another? And then additionally, yeah, let's start there actually. So we'll start with you this time, Rich.
I admit, I don't put a lot of stock in them, of course. But if I had to say one type is better than the other, the Thomistic Aristotelian arguments tend to strike me as better. I think they are more sort of they do fewer obvious leaps of inference all the way to God. It seems like the case is tighter all the way down to God versus, for instance, the Kalam cosmological arguments, which sort of makes this leap from the external cause of the universe to being in God. I think, like I said, the Thomistic arguments are tighter. I have sort of explored those with Thomas, but when I do so, I find, because it's very different from the type of arguments you often see from Protestant, and it's a really different type of argument. I usually find I have to sort of bone up again on the Thomistic modes of thought to engage in those. So that's my thoughts anyway.
All right, interesting. Yeah, and David, what do you think?
Yeah, they're fascinating. I love all of them. Like, honestly, I mean, cosmological arguments is probably my favorite. I think they're just fascinating and they're fun to explore. They keep the idea of discovery open, So it's like that whole interest when you look up at the stars at night and you're just like, man, what caused this, or is there something else out here? It's just it grips my imagination. So I really think it's cool. But I do like the Thomistic arguments, and Rich is right. They are you got to bone up on them quite a bit because they're longer. I mean, they're the one I have sitting right next to me is got 10 premises, so I mean, they're long. The Kalam is short, but I think you can actually merge some of the Kalam and Thomistic arguments together and probably come up with a pretty fascinating cosmological argument, which is what I'm working on. But I think when it comes to implications, we do have to consider it. And you're right, some people do make too broad of leaps. As Rich was saying with certain ideas, as I was talking with Jeff Zerwink the other day, is like, if you only have a cosmological argument in your tool belt, then you've got issues. I mean, it's not like the end all be all. You need a lot more than a cosmological argument to make a cumulative case. So I'm glad to see that you're actually working more on other arguments as well, and this is just one of them. So yeah, the as far as cosmological arguments, yes, I think that we do have to deal with the implications of them. So yeah, they're fun to talk about.
Awesome. No, I fully agree with you guys, right? It's not going to get you all the way there, but it's a step in the right direction. I think is how Jeff talked about it on the, it's progress is how your guest made it. So yeah, cool. Obviously, I go for the Leibnizian cosmological argument, sort of that argument from contingency, and that's what we're going to be focusing on mostly in today's show. Although I'll be incorporating elements of the Kalam into that as well. Um, the other thing that I wanted to ask you guys by way of introduction, I kind of framed my series in order to evaluate any cosmological argument. There are really five main umbrella objections or categories of objections that an atheist can give against it that I find. So the first one is, okay, obviously a cosmological argument has to have a cosmic fact to explain or to say what caused it or something like that. And an atheist can just deny the truth of the cosmic fact. The universe began to exist. No, it didn't. It's eternal. Or the universe is contingent. No, it's not. It's necessary. Something like that. Secondly, there's what's called, Proust calls the Glendora Problem. So this is where you say, okay, well, you have this cosmic fact, but does it actually require an explanation or a cause in the first place? How do we know that it actually needs something? And this is where Christians will typically throw in either an explanatory principle, like the principle of sufficient reason, or some kind of causal principle, either a local one or a non-local one. And the difference there is just local applies to things that are finite, non-local applies to eternal things that need a cause, an eternal causal chain or whatever. Then you also have the taxi cab fallacy. That's the traditional thing, okay, well, maybe if you say God created the universe, well, who created God? That's kind of the typical way of saying this. There's also the infinite regress problem. And then there's the thing that I know Rich really likes, the dreaded gap problem. Okay, great. I'll grant you everything. It needs this necessary cause, but that's not God. How do you plug that gap and get to God? So I just wanted to kind of turn it to you guys. What do you guys make of this framework of objections that I used by the atheists? And I'll start with you, David, this time.
Wow, that's a lot. Let's we should probably go over one by one. But the cosmic fact, that's an interesting one because you know as well as I do that you have to. It's not concluded that the universe began, right? So we have to come up with an argument that says, okay, we have better evidence that it may have began to exist. And I think that's where we are in cosmology, is that it's looking like there is a beginning, right? So each time we try to have a model that comes about, it either fails or a new discovery happens and we're pushed back to the original model where there is a beginning. So I do think we can make the case for it, although it's not set in stone. It's not a fact. So I wouldn't call it a cosmic fact. I would call it, yes, we have a better argument and the evidence leans more in favor of a beginning, but we're not there yet, so we don't know 100%. But I think with the arguments we make as far as philosophical arguments and what we see from science and observation and so forth, that we have a better argument. I would say it's like 80% to 20% that the universe began to exist, or maybe even more than that. But we don't know for sure because we don't have a theory of quantum gravity, plain and simple. So the gap problem that Rich is kind of justified in if there is no beginning, so I think that the strongest case against cosmological arguments would be if the universe didn't begin.
All right, cool. And yeah, Rich, what do you make just in general of these 5 atheistic objections? Have I missed anything? Do you think this is a good way of evaluating them? Oh, you're muted, just so you know.
Yeah, those are objections, of course. So I think it's good that you address them. And definitely the gap problem is one I'm going to want to get to. And I suppose maybe it's part of the gap problem, and that in those objections, I didn't see exactly the take I would be bringing to this, which, so I guess we'll get to. The take I sort of want to bring to it is really just a sort of a problem in special pleading, and a problem in even trying to speculate about these things, and a problem with a basic problem in explanations that I think you run into when you're speculating this much about what could have caused the universe. And I have some things to say about that we can, hopefully we can get to. But were you going to lay out your cosmological argument? And I have a question about it before you do.
So yeah, that's what I'm going to do next. So
okay,
you might as well raise your question now if you want to.
Sure. So the one thing here is that if it's going to be a sort of like the universe had a cause and I call that cause God kind of thing, that's not really something I and many atheists are too interested in, right? We're interested in how you get to, then you can say, I'm going to call bananas God and I've established God. You're not going to do something that simplistic, but I'm just talking about the type of God that we're talking about, that we're looking to establish. And I would be hoping that we would be talking about like a personal God. So in Plantinga's words, the world was created by God, an almighty, all-knowing, and perfectly good personal being. And especially, one that holds beliefs, has aims, plans, and intentions, and can act to accomplish these aims. So these are typical characteristics of a God that I think we're most interested in, and seeing if you can derive those from the cosmological arguments, whether they are in fact actually arguments for this type of God. So I don't know if you want to tell me, is your argument seeking to be sort of logical argument where God is necessarily entailed as a cause, or are you using a appeal to the best explanation?
So I would say it's more the former. So I know you got the latter in your debate with Blake Giunta. So I more like to approach it the way you do, Val. So I'm going to be, when we get to premise 3, I will be establishing that this God is personal. And I've got some arguments on that front, so we will definitely be going over that. But maybe I should let me just share my screen and just let the audience see what my argument is in premise format. Okay. So here is my argument, my version of the cosmological argument. So it's basically adopting William Lane Craig's or the Stephen T. Davis version of this argument, and I've adapted it. So premise 1 is that, look, the universe, and I'm defining the universe as all of space and time and its contents, this exists contingently. So it's a contingent existing thing. So that's my cosmic fact, that the universe exists contingently. Premise 2, this is where I address the Glendora problem. So I throw in a moderate version of the principle of sufficient reason, which is, generally speaking, every existing thing has a sufficient explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own internal nature or in an external cause. And then premise 3 is where I address the last 3 problems: the taxicab fallacy, the infinite regress problem, and that gap problem. And it's basically saying, well, if the universe has a sufficient explanation of its existence, that explanation is God 1. So this kind of God 1, this is relevant to what Rich was just asking. What the heck does that mean? And I gave a kind of minimal definition of God 1, right? So I just said, well, look, it's minimally whatever can be proven either directly or indirectly with supplemental argumentation from the cosmological argument itself, or the implications of what we prove in our cosmological argument. So that I could, hypothetically, God 1 could just be, oh, well, there's a necessary external cause of the universe, and I could throw up my hands and say, look, God one is established, God, because God one is just whatever minimally can be proven. But obviously that's not interesting. So yes, during the gap problem, I will be taking it a step further. And the strongest of that is the fact that we can establish, well, this isn't just some necessary, spaceless, timeless, powerful being, but it's a personal being. So God one is going to be, we're going to find out it's more expanded than just a metaphysically necessary being. So, well, does that make sense? Just for both of the guests, do you guys get the argument in general and how it works? Yeah,
I believe so.
All right, awesome. All right, so with that said, let's get into evaluating each of the premises. And so we'll start with premise one, that the universe is a contingent existing thing. In the first place, I divided this up into two aspects in order to prove. So the first is that the universe is in fact an existing thing. And I explained what that means. And then the second aspect is that it's a contingent existing thing. So it's contingent in its existence. So I just want to kind of ask you guys very quickly, first of all, do you guys agree with this premise? Without explaining, first and foremost, do you guys think that yes, it's true, the universe is contingent or not? And
Well,
Rich?
of course, I think it is.
Okay, good. Rich?
I simply don't know. I'm just trying to have some humility about that. But I've seen arguments pro and con, but I'm just fine going along with it being contingent.
Okay, awesome. Okay, cool. But just for the sake of the audience, I do want to kind of go over some of my argumentation and spend some time on that just to see what you guys think. So, okay, so the first thing with aspect one, is the universe an existing thing? And I kind of laid out, what does that mean, right? So in the first place, what does it mean for something to exist? And obviously we've all heard existence is not a predicate, it's not a property or something, right? So I look at existence is a special kind of relation. It's a belonging relation or an instantiation relation or something like that. So whenever a given thing instantiates certain properties or properties belong to a given thing, that's what we mean by existence. And that's what I've used in this argument. But then there's the interesting question, it might sound silly, well, what does it mean to be a thing? But this is actually an important question as well. So there are three types of things based on their degree of unity. There's a heap, so that has the loosest type of unity, you know, a heap of salt or a heap of garbage, something like that. Then there's a property thing, which has the next higher up degree of unity, but it's where, you know, physical objects are property things. Their parts are prior to the whole. It doesn't preserve its essence through physical change. You know, like if you remove one of the parts or legs of a chair, it's not the same chair. Or if, you know, different physical relations or parts means that it doesn't preserve its sameness. It's not the same thing. And then there's the substance, the classical definition of a substance, which the whole is prior to the parts and it preserves its unity, regardless of physical changes and stuff like that. And my argument, I kind of said that I think the universe is a property thing. So that means it can't maintain trans-world identity and stuff like that. It's not, it doesn't maintain the same over physical change and stuff like that. But I want to throw it open to you guys. What do you guys make of what I think it means for the universe to be an existing thing? Do you disagree with me and think that no, the universe is something else? David, yeah, I'll start with you this time.
Well, Dale, you know, I'm gonna agree with you. Basically, I mean, just gave the Aristotelian idea of things. Basically, I hold to that as well. I don't think we've been able to show anything else besides that. I don't know if there's any other ideas out there. Maybe Rich can jump into it, but I mean, you just described it in a different way. I think that once we look into and I think even Aquinas piggybacked off of this when he started talking about actuality, potential, and change and stuff like that. So yeah, man, I agree with you. I think your assessment is right on, and I don't think you're going to get that much pushback from Rich either.
Well, do you think, because this is important in terms of some of the arguments I can use, do you also agree with me that the universe is a property thing, or do you think it might be a different type of thing? Or
I think you're right, and this is Rich may have a different take on it, but I would agree with you overall. So yeah, I maybe the wordage is different than I would use, but I think we're going for the same thing here.
Cool. All right, cool. Yeah, Rich.
Yeah, so I think you've expressed something close enough to what I can just accept as well. I mean, there's a sort of a version of naturalism which appeals to sort of the axiom that things have natures. Anything that exists has a nature, and you could almost say that to exist is to have a nature. In some of the ways that you just described, what it's like, what a thing is and what it isn't, its constrictions on its nature, and that this is a sort of a basic assumption needed to make things intelligible and to justify further forms of knowledge. So, I mean, you say, why doesn't, if you even think of almost like the problem of induction kind of thing, why does a flame burn our finger one time and not freeze it the next time? Well, as far as we can, because fire has a nature, and as far as we can see, its nature is to always be hot and burn. And there's nothing in our investigation of the nature of fire that suggests that it has the ability to change and therefore freeze our finger the next time. And the sort of the assumption that things have natures partially justifies the empirical inquiry as in to try and understand and predict things. And in the same way, and because of that, you have to make that same assumption about a God too, that if you're going to try and make God the necessary axiom for intelligibility and for science and all that kind of stuff, well, you have to first assume God has a nature too, that God is like this or not like that. So you really just end up assuming what you already assume to justify nature and science, et cetera, anyways. So yeah, there's a sort of naturalistic version of this that I can sort of go along with.
Okay, awesome. And just so I know, would you also agree that the universe is a property thing, or do you think it might be a substance?
I'm not sure. I admit I don't have an opinion on that.
Okay. So I think I'm happy with aspect one. It's kind of a self-evident thing. I think even Matt Dillahunty said that you're a fool if you kind of deny that the universe is an existing thing, type deal. So let's kind of turn to aspect two, and this one took up the bulk of my series. Okay, what type of existing thing is the universe? Is it in fact contingent or not? And on this front, so I had several arguments. So in the first place, I offered a couple of modal arguments for the contingency of the universe. And this is why it matters what type of thing the universe is. So depending on that, I might have two arguments versus just one. So here's my first argument with the modal argument. It's, look, through our modal evaluating faculties or modal properly basic beliefs and that sort of thing, we can conceive of different universes. And this is backed up through the modern cosmology and stuff like that, right? We have different models. These are each different universes type thing, you could argue. I would argue we can also conceive of possible worlds where there's no universe at all. And atheists do this all the time when they bring up the problem of evil or something. They'll say, well, God shouldn't have created the universe. He should have just not created anything at all. That would have been better. So implied in that claim of the atheists is, well, they can picture a possible world, hypothetically, where this God exists alone. and or where our universe doesn't actually exist. And given the definition of what it means for something to be contingent, that just means it exists in some possible worlds, but doesn't exist in all of them. So there's even one possible world where our universe doesn't exist or a different universe exists. That establishes the contingency. So I'll leave it there for the first modal argument. What do you guys think? Should I bring up the second one first or let you guys respond to the first one?
Well, maybe it's not time to get into this, but I guess what leaps to mind is that I think it was Hume who said the same thing about God, right? I can conceive of God not existing just as I can conceive of him existing. Sounds like it makes him contingent that way, but I guess we're not there yet.
No, not really. But
okay.
Yeah, that will come up. David Hume's when we address PSR and like counter modal intuitions. So, okay, so that's cool. So, would you guys agree with that then, or?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, David, what do you think of that? Okay. Okay. Nothing to say there. Okay, so here's the second modal argument that I want to get your guys' take on, and this one it's key. If the universe is a property thing, then this argument would fail, because I basically said, well, again, in the same way, through our modal evaluating faculties, we can also conceive of possible worlds where our universe exists, but instead of being eternal, it began to exist or something like that. So that it's kind of assuming trans-world identity, but that only applies if the universe is a substance. So that's why I think I kind of screwed up in my video and I changed my mind to eliminating this argument. If the universe is a property thing, it doesn't survive either relational or part changes, and that sort of thing. And a universe, conceiving of our universe where it began to exist as opposed to existing eternally, that has different physical relations and that sort of thing. So it's not the same universe. But yeah, I just wanted to get your guys' kind of take on that. Do you think that argument will work if the universe were a substance or something? Or yeah, what do you guys make of that argument?
I'm gonna go with it.
yeah, you could go. I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah.
I'm still at that point where like I don't know. I think your first argument there, the first one we just went over, I think that's the best one that I was able to like think about it and be like, yeah, I'm on board with that, you know? And I mean, Rich brought up that one objection, but of course we're not there yet. We'd have to talk more in detail about that. But yeah, so I would say the first one is good. I'm still thinking about the second one. I would have to go back and read it and then digest it a little bit. I don't know if that's the same that you would do, Rich.
Same here.
Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough then. All right, cool. So yeah, just so the audience knows it again, I feel
see, you know the thing is, Dale, is like your cosmological series was so thorough that there's so many aspects of it that like we would have to, you know, it's a lot to digest. So like it would also be very helpful if we had like the transcripts where we could look into the arguments in a written form as well.
That was the issue I had trying to get through it as well in the video form. I was wondering if there was a transcript.
Yeah, I've got like a 200-page write-up.
There you go.
Yeah, let me share the screen for the audience, just so they can see.
I don't doubt it.
Yeah, no, just so people can see. So here's on my blog page, right? That's the Existence of God series, Cosmological Argument continued.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I went to your page and I didn't find it.
You know,
okay,
I
good
don't
to know it's there.
I've never even seen your written stuff, Dale. That's crazy.
Yeah,
I've never even seen it.
Yeah, it's right here. I've got
good. Okay.
This is the thing, table of contents. So yeah, if you click on that, you follow along. It's all written there. It's a lot. It's 200 pages, but it's yeah, it's interesting that you guys prefer the written to the video, because I thought that it would be like the opposite. Most people.
Well, I mean, the videos are good. Like I love listening to it on the way to work, you know, and thinking about it. But with how thorough it is, you're only going to catch pieces of it at a time, and be able to digest it that way, versus the written form. We can go through each premise. We have another written thing we can come back to. And I think that's the benefit of that, so.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, that's my feeling as a host. I should have gave you guys, sent you guys the link to the write-up. All right, cool. Well, too late now, but
it's okay. I watched your video, so got the gist of it. But yeah, please go on. It's cool.
All right, cool. All right. So the next part you guys will be familiar with, whether you've listened to my videos or not. But the next part is in terms of arguing the contingency of the universe. This is where I bring in the Kalam cosmological argument, and straightforward, getting from William Lane Craig. He's got his 4 arguments. I condensed it to 3. But it's basically arguing, well, look, in fact, forget about whether it's possible the universe began to exist with the modal arguments. This time we're saying, in fact, in actuality, the universe is not eternal. It began to exist. And eternality is an essential, Rich was talking about essential natures or kind natures and stuff like that. It's essential for something to be necessary. It has to be eternal. If it's not eternal, it's not necessary, and it's therefore contingent. So yeah, that's the next part is I wanted to prove that the universe is in fact not eternal. And on that front, I first started with William Lane Craig's 2 deductive philosophical arguments. And the first one was just saying that it's impossible for an actual infinite to exist in reality. And I gave arguments for that. William Lane Craig's argument with Hilbert's Hotel is a prime example explaining that. So do you guys both are familiar with that? Would you like me to explain how Hilbert's Hotel works?
No, I think we all understand it.
No,
we probably read it hundreds and hundreds of times, but yeah, no. Right, cool. Yeah, Dale, you're good.
All right, cool. So David, let me turn it to you. What is your take on this first deductive philosophical argument about actual infinites? Does it work? What do you think?
Well, infinity, it's a funny concept, right? So it's always incomplete. So I would agree with what the assessments that you came up with. I mean, I don't think we can have an actual infinite. I think it was Kasner and somebody else said that, when you talk about infinity, it's a lot different than talking about like fish in the sea, like an infinite, like an infinity of fish in the sea, and I butchered that quote, but it goes along those lines to say, yeah, that how we discuss infinity. And I think you point this out well, is that an actual infinite is a lot different than a potential infinite, and that's how I always was able to understand it the best, was actual versus potential, because I could say, okay, this is actual, as like it's in the real world, versus something that's potential, which is stuff that we can like use our imaginations to say, yeah, if we get to 999, then we add one, that's the potential of it, so that's kind of like how I make sense of it in my head. But I do agree with you. So awesome. On infinites, and I would take the same line as Craig on that one.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, Rich, what do you make of this? I'm interested.
Yeah, I always promised myself I would never talk about Hilbert hotels or anything even close to actual infinites. So after seeing the debate through so many times. So like I said, as far as these type of logical or metaphysical arguments, for instance, the debate between Sean Carroll and William Lane Craig, I found Carroll more convincing on that. His sort of take that the metaphysics were, as he sort of said, it was hot stuff at one point, but we've got other ways of explaining things now via physics. It's not like you completely skip philosophy that way, but I think I just found the case that Carroll made more compelling than what I keep seeing from theists such as Craig. And so I don't really have a big opinion, though, personally, on the possibility of real infinites. And I don't think it affects the scope of what I'm looking to question. I don't think.
Okay, and just to confirm, just as a quick follow-up, so you would say, do you think that it's possible that this deductive philosophical argument, if it works, could overrule the scientific evidence suggesting that infinites do exist, or is it only one way? The science will always overwhelm a philosophical argument or something?
Well, I think as I remembered it, Carroll's, I mean, to a certain degree, every explanation is philosophical, Carroll appealed to the fact that that you can come up with models that are essentially a closed loop, and that insofar as they work, you just don't have to appeal to any of this problem of infinites, etc. So I'm not sure I would even necessarily divide it into science versus philosophy as just as explanations versus explanations. But like I said, I don't have a good take on the possibility of actual infinites. I understand your question. I think it's a hard one to answer.
Gotcha. All right, cool. Okay, so I understand your guys' take on that. Obviously, I agree with it. Just, I guess, very quickly for the sake of the audience, I think that there are certain logical contradictions that are an inevitable part, the inherent part of supposing that there's an actual infinite. And this violates two mathematical principles that are self-evident, everyone agrees to, that look, if there's two sets and they have one-to-one, their members are one-to-one correspondence, well, then those are identical sets. If it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, those are identical. And then also if there's another set that's 1, 2, 3, well, this is a proper subset of the original set. They're not identical, it's a subset. But obviously if you, oh, go ahead, Rich, you're gonna say something.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, so if the argument ends up showing incoherence, then yeah, like pure logical incoherence, then yeah, I think that's more basic than, for instance, just empirical inquiry. The problem is lots of even metaphysical arguments seem to have to appeal to some form of empiricism to fill some of the premises. But if you're able to have like an almost entirely a priori a case making for it incoherent, then I think you would have to be accepted. I'm not sure that you do that or not, but you know, that would be my take on it.
All right, cool. Yeah, well, that's awesome. So then that would be progress, because believe it or not, even Anthony 6.6, no mathematician in the world would disagree with the fact that logical contradictions are inevitably entailed by transfinite math or using actual infinites. And in axiomatic set theory, this is why you're just not allowed to do certain operations, just as a brute fact axiom, because if you can't do subtraction of actual infinities or division or something like that, because these contradictions will inevitably arise. And I think they arise they violate the principles even if we're adding, right? Because you'll have an actual infinite plus an actual infinite, which is represented by the number Aleph null, equals an actual infinite, Aleph null, right? So that violates, you have subsets that are supposedly identical. Well, that's logically contradictory and stuff like that. But yeah, so I would just wanted to say, mathematicians, even Anthony 6.6, as much as he would want to disagree with me, he would agree that at least certain operations inherently involve contradiction. So that might be a step forward if what I'm saying is true and stuff like that. So.
No, I think it's the biggest step, and this is I think it's the strength of the philosophical argument, because it shows that we can actually come to true knowledge through philosophical arguments. And I think this is one that I think is very persuasive to me, because I when going back and looking over this and studying it and stuff like that, I just pulled out my notes on this, and I do have that quote by Kasner and Newman, who say the existence in the mathematical sense is wholly different from the existence of objects in the physical world. This, the infinite certainly does not exist in the same way that we say there are fish in the sea. And then A.W. Moore says even Cantor, which talking about set theory here, was adamant throughout his life that the whole idea of an infinitesimal was demonstrably inconsistent. So I do think you're onto something there. And I think that you're taking what these philosophers have been saying for real. I mean, for years. I mean, Ghazali was the first one that we have, I guess, written record of discussing it, or maybe not. It may have gone back even further than that. But because I think you mentioned what was it, the Greek example?
Paradox.
Yeah, you bit that. You went over that too. So yeah, I think you're onto something there, man, and I think it's a good argument. It's solid from what I can tell.
Awesome. All right, awesome. Yeah, I agree totally. And you mentioned like Zeno's paradox and stuff like that, so it is important to mention that there are two distinct philosophical arguments, and I won't go over both of them just because I know Rich isn't necessarily, he said his piece about the philosophical argument, so I'll turn to the science. But just for the audience, it is important to note that there are two philosophical arguments. So the one I was giving is that actual infinites in general are just impossible, and that's where Hilbert's hotel comes in and stuff like that. But there's also a second philosophical argument that says, okay, great, let's pretend actual infinites are possible in general, but a specific type of actual infinite is impossible. And that's where you form one through successive addition. And that's where Al-Ghazali was coming in, right? Like you add one element after another, and they'll say that type of infinite is impossible. So yeah, just keep that in mind, that there are those distinctions. All right.
Yeah, and I think it's good that even like when it comes to the universe, even like Hawking quotes, in the composite of space, there is only a finite amount of information it can hold. So I think it goes to show even further that these arguments are valid and strong. How we get around them, I don't know, unless we just accept some sort of paradox.
Exactly. Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. All right, cool. Well, Rich, I'm going to turn it to what you want to talk about. Well, not what you want to, but let's finish off the first premise with some kind of discussion about the scientific evidence, the state of current cosmology. Rich, what do you think about? I kind of made an abductive argument based on the scientific evidence from the thermodynamic properties of the universe and the expansion of the universe. And we have various proofs. So there's the in terms of the expansion of the universe, there's the redshift effect, there's the light element abundance, there's the CMB, that radiation that everyone knows, the cosmic microwave background radiation. And then we also have the Hawking-Penrose singularity theorem and the BVG singularity theorem. So these were the scientific data points that I used to, in addition to the thermodynamic properties of the universe, to say that the universe probably began to exist. So just in general, what's your take on the scientific avenue?
Well, my take is once again, it still seems open to speculation. Scientists seem very cautious about the conclusions they draw on even talking about the beginning of the universe. But I'm fine, for sake of argument, just going with the universe began, and just accepting, for sake of argument, that current cosmology and physics points to the universe beginning. So that's fine just to go along with, and then you get to talking about the cause.
Okay. All right, cool. I promise we'll get there, and I'm keeping an eye on the time. So
no problem.
Okay. Just before I turn it to David, I did want to ask you one follow-up question then, and it's kind of a meta thing, so you don't have to know about the science and stuff. But I remember when I was kind of talking to you about my videos on the scientific evidence. So parts 3A and 3B for the audience is where I kind of go over all the models and stuff. And you kind of mentioned, well, look, I don't want to learn science from a Christian kind of thing, right? You didn't kind of trust hearing it from a Christian. So like, I just kind of wanted to throw it open. I was curious, like, why is that? Have you found that like Christians tend to be more in error or than atheists? Like, oh, yeah, just sort of curious about that.
Is that for?
I thought it was for you, David.
No, that was for you, Rich. Like,
oh, sorry. Sorry. I was,
Yeah, I'm like,
I'm sorry. You know what, Dale? I blanked out for a moment because I thought you were talking to David and I was looking at a note. Could you repeat
the
that,
same
please?
thing. I was like, he's talking to Rich. I could just read what I'm going to say about the
that was
scientific
pretty sad.
evidence.
If David as a Christian, I don't listen to Christians. I was just saying, I remember months back, like when I kind of first made my video, you mentioned to me that like, well, look, I'm hesitant to listen to a Christian give their take on science. And
oh, okay.
So it's kind of a meta question. Yeah, I was just curious, like what is your reasoning behind that?
Because I have consistently found reasoning from theist suspects whenever it comes to, I mean even from the ground up, from if you sort of take a fundamentalist denial of evolution, and when you look at their take on the science, it's just wrong through the board, and that's a low-hanging fruit. But each time I've encountered Christian arguments and Christian interpretations or infills, I haven't found them convincing, and they always strike me as examples of highly motivated thinking. We all suffer from that, but that's what strikes me from it continually. When, as I said, I came through skeptical literature of where they investigate spiritualism and beliefs in UFO cults and all that kind of stuff like that. And there was just this common denominator through all of them about the way they argued for their beliefs that I just see repeated in Christianity. And so I've just grown a suspicion to a skepticism of taking, the Christians' take on cosmology or physics or anything like that. I want to hear it from a physicist or a cosmologist, not from somebody who is trying to get to approve of their religion.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's not so much.
And I should just say, it doesn't mean, of course, that Christians can be wrong about this. There are Christian scientists, right, who are experts in this, right?
Especially
and so I will certainly listen to a scientist who's a Christian, obviously, but it's sort of within the context of that form of expertise that I would want to hear it. If you see what I mean.
I do. Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. So it's more about the division between an expert opinion versus things.
That's closer to it.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, David, let me throw it open to you just in general kind of thing. Like, what do you make of, I know you just did a show with Jeff Zurink. So like, what do you make of the current state of cosmology? Does it prove the contingency of the universe?
Yeah, over in Pora, we are definitely in the cosmological phase of our apologetic arguments. But as Rich can also attest, as he talked about it as well.
That's right. Yeah.
But yeah. Actually, man, this is I could spend all day talking about this. You know, I was thinking that I could just leave the cosmological argument open for my show forever because there's so much you can talk about. But I was like, I got to conclude it at some point. So, but yeah, so like, I think that there's, and I think Rich said it, he's just like, you know what, it's okay to go to say that the universe began to exist because the science does point that way. It's so funny. Like the people that speculate about this, they're speculating off a billionth of a second. We can rewind, and this is just a natural intuition, right? I'm not going to say that this isn't science, right? So, but if I rewind the clock all the way back, I get to a 1 billionth of a second. You know, the natural intuition is that there's a starting point, there is a beginning, right? But there is such a divide among the scientific community of what happens in that billionth of a second, you know, because things break down, you know, the general relativity breaks down, you know. I think Aaron Wall does a great job when he talks about the generalized second rule of thermodynamics can actually get us back to Penrose singularity theorem. I think that's very positive. I think I think there's, in other words, I think there's a lot of evidence because each time that you get a new model, it keeps getting pushed back to a beginning model, right? So we keep seeing this over. We can't escape the singularity, it seems. Don't know why. It could be just something we're doing wrong, or it could be anything. It could be that, hey, there is a beginning. And I think that's where the conversation leads. And it's funny when you look at like some of the reasons these guys don't want there to be a beginning, right? Some of them have come out and admittedly said, hey, it's going to be the end of science, if there's a beginning. I think that was Carol in what an interview on that show. Oh man, I can't remember the name of it, but it was on a show, and I remember that's he thought it would be the end of science. But yeah, there's so many different reasons, and there is a big section of this community of cosmology that are theists, and it's actually a lot larger than in other areas. And from who I've talked to, as far as Jeff and as far as Hugh and stuff like that, they say that this theory comes up, and you can see it does come up quite a bit. This God question comes up quite a bit in the discussion of the beginning of the universe. So I don't know if that's part of it, but it is definitely very interesting to observe. But there are so many different things. You use the BVG theorem, which these guys, B, V, and G, they Borgluth and Vilenkin, they actually have different theories on the eternality of the universe. Vilenkin uses quantum tunneling versus was it Guth that I think is working with Sean Carroll on his model, with the reverse arrow of time. So you just got a lot of different models out there, and you got a lot of different guys working on this, and it's pretty wild. It's definitely an interesting study, but I do think at the end of the day that you're not escaping the beginning of the universe. But that's just my opinion. So I think it's a good argument.
Yeah, and I fully agree. I think it's slightly weaker than the philosophical deductive arguments. Obviously, by nature, it's an abductive one, but I definitely think on a balance of probabilities, it's a pretty good abductive argument. And I guess I like what you said there, David Russell, where you also mentioned the thermodynamic properties of the universe is a key evidence as well. It's not just the expansion rate. And I find that a lot of the discussion on the science of cosmology always focuses on the evidence for the expansion of the universe. But there's also the second law of thermodynamics and how that rules out a whole host of eternal cosmological models as being plausible or possible and that sort of thing. So I won't waste a lot of time on this because I know that both my guests really want to get to that third premise, but I'll just say this one thing to wrap up premise one. I evaluated all of the models that I was able to study. I actually read the scientific papers. The best model, if you're an atheist and you want to argue the universe is eternal, I think that the loop quantum gravity model is probably the best. So it avoids the singularity. It's one of it counts under quantum gravity models with like the singularity theorems. There are various conditions whereby you can propose an eternal universe, right? So there's eternal inflationary models is one exception to Hawking-Penrose singularity theorem, and then the BVG theorem narrows that list down even more. But there's also these quantum gravity models, but with the loop quantum gravity models, I found that it worked. It almost served as a justified defeater for the Kalam cosmological argument, but for the thermodynamic properties of the universe, it struggles with that, explaining this entropy buildup and why our universe had a low entropy beginning point. Now, obviously, the scientists try to come up with an explanation. They'll say, well, kind of like Roger Penrose argues, well, maybe it's erased or diminished. It actually decreases, meaning it violates the second law of thermodynamics in some way. But I just found that I found it improbable, as do most scientists. And that was my basis for ruling that out. But I think that, just to be fair to the atheist, I think that's, out of all the models we have, that's where it's at. That's the best possibility for an eternal model. So,
well, I mean, you mentioned it fails on the thermodynamic spectrum, and I just think that I think Wahl does a great job in his papers on having that generalized second law and stuff like that. So I think that's, that's where we're at. I mean, they propose models, it's speculation, and that's where we're at, unfortunately. But I think once we look at the observable evidence, the philosophical evidence, and the scientific evidence, points to a beginning, intuitively and observationally, right? So it points to it. I'm not going to say it definitely does begin to exist, but probably begins to exist. I think it's a good explanation there. So
cool. Awesome. Yeah, I agree. So, all right, cool. So I will move on for the sake of time. So I'm sorry about that, Rich, but
would you guys not agree that, given you're talking about appealing to the science, that one thing it seems we've learned scientifically is how often the science ends up subverting many of our intuitions? I certainly wouldn't intuit that the universe came from a spot so small it could fit on a, there's various estimates, you know what I mean? That all came from this. I mean, there's so many ways, also evolution theory, et cetera, it subverts intuitions. It just seems our intuitions and our intuitions are continually subverted. So it seems to me we want to be pretty miserly with our intuitions.
Absolutely. And the only reason I bring the intuition in is because I think this is one of the times that I've discovered in my studies and stuff is that my intuitions haven't been averted. Right. And that that the evidence actually points to something that just I intuitively would think when I rewind the clock, so to speak, right? But it's very interesting. And of course that's always a possibility that the science can totally upturn my worldview. And that's why I say probably versus definite, but when things are lining up in a row and I'm getting down to a billionth of a second, right? It's just it's to me it's strong. It makes the case strong that there's a beginning. And I do hold the possibility of having my worldview or not my worldview, but my view of the beginning of the universe flipped, right? And I think that's fair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I would agree that there are definitely.
I'm sorry, Dale, go on.
Oh no, go ahead, Rich.
I'm just saying that So I certainly get that. That in this case you had an intuition which seems to have been borne out by this part of the science, but given your and many other people's intuitions on other things, et cetera, have been subverted by science, it's a caution about the actual reliability of our intuitions, whether one happens to line up with how things bear out or not, if you see what I mean. I can flip a coin.
I'm not sure. Like when I look at the Book of Nature and stuff like this, I think it actually confirms my theistic views. So I would probably be a little bit different than others on that, Rich. I think that the Book of Nature confirms it, and I think there's things in nature that aren't in the Bible that the Bible doesn't speak about. So, and stuff like that. So it's not beholden to a certain intuition that I might have an intuition that's not even based on my theistic beliefs. And then it totally gets flipped upside down, and that's fine. I make room for change. And that's I think we all have to do that. So, but yeah, I would agree. And yes, I do think there's at times science does flip our intuitions, but there's sometimes there's many times even that your hypotheses are proven right. And where do most hypotheses begin with a intuition or a thought? So
most hypotheses turn out to be unproven, though. Most scientists' hypotheses fail. right? That most
A lot of times. A lot of
I mean,
times.
scientists always say that you're incredibly lucky if one or two of your hypotheses through your lifetime,
And
bear
I'm
fruit.
given obviously a long term, but another thing is the specificity of your hypothesis too. Like it starts with that intuition or a thought, but then you're going to have to change it or adjust it as you gather more onto that hypothesis, because a hypothesis just isn't a guess or a hey, this, I'm just going to make this out of nowhere. I mean, you have to have some inferential point to really make it. I mean, you have to gather something to put in there as a hypothesis. So it has to come
an intuition isn't necessarily a hypothesis, basically.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Yep.
It may start there, but it has to be adjusted as you go. And that's where I think a lot of what you're saying comes into play. Like, yeah, I mean, my original thought, that was completely out of the window, know. So, but yeah, no, Dale.
Yeah. So I'm just debating. I did want to say something about that, but in the interest of time, maybe I'll leave it up to you. Do you want me to move on to premise 2 quickly, or should I say something about that intuition thing? Or?
Sure. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the first place, I liked David Russell's response that yes, science does sometimes provide us with things that counter our intuitions, but there are also times where it backs up our intuitions and that sort of thing. But I just kind of see the issue of intuitions as being totally beside the point, because at least in my argument, I didn't rely on intuitions at all. I relied purely on the scientific data that we have, and I made an inference, obviously, to the best explanation using the criteria. I don't know if maybe that's an intuitional aspect, but for example, the second law of thermodynamics, which is I think is very powerful evidence against a lot of the models, including the ones I think are the best, like those loop quantity gravity things. So you might say, well, the second law of thermodynamics applies to macro and stuff and what we see. So maybe it doesn't apply when the universe is at a quantum scale or something, right? So you might say, well, we're relying on intuition there, but no, I'm not. Aaron Wall has made what David Russell refers to as that general, this is what made him famous, the generalized second law of thermodynamics. It applies to the quantum level as well, and that would imply a singularity there. And when it comes to the second law of thermodynamics, it's not speculation or that sort of thing. That this is the most firmly established field of empirical science that we know with almost absolute certainty about. So, there's a famous quote, and I'll end here. There's a famous quote, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but a scientist once said, look, if you come across, if you come up with a hypothesis or come across data that seems to contradict the law of gravity or something like that, well, maybe the theory or the law needs revising. But if you come across something that seemingly contradicts the first and second laws of thermodynamics, you're wrong. Throw out that data. That data is somehow wrong. So that that's kind of just a quote to show like how firm.
Yeah, they're yeah. I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
All right. Cool.
Yeah.
I would just mention, Dale, that my comments about intuition weren't necessarily directed at your argument appealing to this science. That's not where I was going with it. I think it was just queued off of something I heard David say.
Yeah,
I just wanted to get a comment in. So I wasn't trying to say you were appealing to intuitions in that case.
Yeah, I wanted to also justify that too, because me and Rich, we were going back and forth on just common intuitions in science and so forth. It had nothing to do with your argument. It was, I made a comment like, hey, look, things are, you can rewind them back, all the way, and you get to this billionth of a second. Well, intuitively, and some people say, say that, and I wanted to bring it up, but of course, me and Rich, we both agree that, intuitions can get flipped,
Yeah, no, not a problem at all. Yeah, I just wanted to give my take. So, all right, cool. I like that discussion. All right, well, let's move on to the second premise quickly, kind of thing. So this is where I address the Glendora problem. sure, we have this cosmic fact, but does it actually need a cause, or does it actually need an explanation? And this is where I throw in my version of the principle of sufficient reason. So I'll just briefly say a couple things on my version of the principle of sufficient reason. So there are different versions of it, right? And some of them have been shown to be false. So for example, Leibniz himself has what's called, he has like a view where the principle of sufficient reason provides logical entailment. The explanandum is logically entailed by this sufficient reason or something like that. And I think that a lot of philosophers are skeptical of that. I myself think that that is false. William Lane Craig, this was the reason he originally rejected this version of the cosmological argument based on this understanding. But it's important to understand there are weaker versions. And so I'm kind of using a version where it just says, look, everything, not even necessarily every fact kind of thing, has a sufficient explanation of its existence. And that word sufficient is also key here, right? So sufficient explanations are a weaker demand than logically entailing explanations or contrastive explanations or stuff like that. So as long as it's sufficient or adequate to explain why the explanandum exists, that counts as a sufficient explanation. And probabilistic explanations would count as a sufficient explanation under this weakened form. But yeah, so that's a note about the PSR that I'm using. It is a watered down version compared to other versions that speak every fact has to have a sufficient explanation, or Alexander Proust says every contingent fact has to have an explanation. I'm not even going that far. I'm just saying, well, everything has to have a sufficient explanation, either in its own necessity, internal necessity, or in an external cause. So yeah, I won't go on and on about that, but I'll start with you, Rich, this time. I think I started with David first last time. So Rich, what do you think about the PSR? Is that something you can get behind? Do you have problems with it? Or
Yeah, so I like this part of the discussion. So the premise 2 in the PSR. This, I think, actually gets to the heart of my take on this, which is the nature of explanations. So if you look at your justification for the principle of sufficient reason, it's similar to others I've seen from theists justifying the principle of sufficient reason. It's essentially justified, I guess you might say pragmatically, in that justified in its usefulness and also in the liabilities if you abandon it, right? So if somebody says, well, why should I use it? Well, why should I appeal to it? Well, then the response is to point out the liabilities of abandoning it. So one of the liabilities is, for instance, like the problem of brute facts, right? So if a football is flying past me and we presume that there's a sufficient reason that for that football flying through the air, but if I just say, oh no, it's just a brute fact that it's flying through the air, right? I don't have to appeal to the principle of sufficient reason. Well, that just seems like an automatic liability in terms of a sort of explanatory power. It seems to open a Pandora's box where brute facts can be posited for practically anything, and then you don't seem to learn anything. And then you can try and say, okay, well, no, let's be really careful about positing brute facts, where we will only be allowed to use brute facts if we've done our best investigation. We can't come up with an answer to this, then we can say, well, maybe it's just a brute fact. That also seems to have the liability of becomes like a brute fact of the gaps, right? And so previously, almost everything we know now, we didn't know. And if we just plugged those with brute facts, then we wouldn't have got to the knowledge we actually do of the world. So like I'm saying, the justification for the PSR seems to me rests on the liabilities of abandonment. Would you agree to worth that much?
Maybe. I think I would need to like hear it again, like re-listen again, kind of.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
no, I think I hear what he's saying. Yeah, I think that the least brute facts, the better.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So you want to, you want to
Yeah, I
minimize.
think what you said just really resonates with me, Rich, and that, just hearing it, what you're saying, I think I'm on board 100% on that.
Yeah. So, so my point about the defense of the PSR generally resting on its usefulness as a principle and its liabilities if you abandon it as a principle, it brings me to my I guess the focus of my critique is in the nature of explanations. And so I would want to say that, for instance, supernatural explanations are a sort of a subcategory of explanations that have similar liabilities. And that's why they generally don't make for very good explanations. They open Pandora's boxes that are hard to shut. And I think that's going to bear on whatever critique I bring here. And I can get more into the nature of explanations, but maybe we should just go on with whatever Dale has to say.
No, yeah, I think I would. I actually agree. I think this lands you in the denial of reason. I mean, brute facts, you can pretty much deny anything based on a brute fact. So I mean, you can, if we deny something like the causal principle or anything like that, I think that's where, I mean, it's just philosophical skepticism. So I think I would just back up what Rich has to say 100% on that. So
yeah. No, sorry, my fault entirely. I was looking something up, so I didn't hear it. But yes, I do fully agree about what your point about the brute facts type thing there. All right. Okay. Well, I like what Rich was saying about the pragmatic reasons, because this was one of the reasons I provided. It was, again, my typical appeal to properly basic beliefs. I know that the PSR is true in a properly basic way, and I gave certain pragmatic reasons, well, look at the implication. Look what you'll have to deny evolution. People would postulate that a monkey goes into a swamp and out pops a human being. Well, if you deny something like the PSR, that's not ridiculous. That's not something that is ridiculous to say, right? So that's kind of something that should trigger within you. Oh yeah, I do know that this principle of sufficient reason is true. In addition to trying to spark properly basic beliefs, because it could be possible that somebody doesn't have this. And indeed, Rich mentioned someone like David Hume. He claimed, he not only denied having a properly basic belief about the principle of sufficient reason being true, he would also say, well, I have properly basic beliefs about it being false, because I can picture an ice cream cone just popping into existence out of nothing, or something like that. So yeah, I guess I can take it there though. So if we are appealing to properly basic beliefs in the first place, and David, I'll start with you here. What about counter claims, David Hume saying, well, I can conceive of an ice cream cone just popping out of nothing. What do we make of stuff like that as a counter argument?
Well, I don't find that in any basis of reality. I don't think we go to bed at night thinking that a horse or something's going to pop into our bedroom or where my Christmas tree is and destroy all the presents and stuff like that. I mean, it's just not realistic, man. So, I mean, no, I think that would be way off base, yeah, I'm sorry. It's just, that's that's worse than magic. Like Craig says, he just, least with the, what does he say? Least with the pulling a rabbit out of the hat, at least you have the magician or something like that. You know what I mean? It's just, yeah, in the hat. So it's, it's ridiculous, I think. But I'm interested to hear what Rich has to say. I think you probably agree, but
yeah, Rich.
Yeah, I wouldn't term it as a properly basic belief. As you know, we've been back and forth on that somewhat. I don't go in for the properly basic beliefs as used by theists. I don't think it gets you there. But I think if you're making arguments for why somebody should accept premises, you can't make them based on your properly basic belief, unless you can give reasons for the other person to accept the premises.
Yeah, and and this is coming. I'm coming at this from a foundationalist point of view. So I'm not I don't endorse the properly basic beliefs probably as you do, Dale, but I do think for the overall question, that's the way why I answered it the way I did is because I just think it's philosophical skepticism, really, just in a nutshell.
Yes, I can accept it provisionally based on the arguments for the consequences.
Right, exactly.
I mean, like it's the same kind of thing. It's like maybe the universe could have no explanation. Reality doesn't owe us anything in particular. But like I said, the liabilities of abandoning the PSR, you can accept the argument that they're just too large. I think most of epistemology has an element of pragmatism in it, since we're not omniscient. And so I think you have to sort of make arguments for abandoning or accepting a principle rather than just to say, I believe it in a properly basic way.
Yeah, and Mackey also says stuff about like the causal principle is confirmed by our experience. So like, why not accept the truth of the causal principle as reasonable and plausible? So I mean, we can accept it until it gets turned on its head, right?
Yeah, this goes back to what I mentioned when we were on your show. That it seems to me an acceptable principle that things are as they seem unless there's reason to doubt, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And the reason to doubt comes from reason and logic applied to experience. Is one thing causing basically a contradiction in another thing, and then we've got to figure out what things to doubt, which not to doubt. But generally, you're always going to need to rely on this, it seems to me, principle of things are as they seem unless there's reason to doubt. It seems to me. I don't know.
Awesome. Yeah, I liked what David said there, and Rich was kind of hinting on about. There is that as an objective evidence. This is the famous one, William Craig. Why aren't there any widespread violations of the PSR that we see all the time? Unicorns popping in and out and stuff. And that, I think that does provide an inductive basis to say that it's probably true at the very least, kind of thing, right? The fact that we don't see widespread violations of the PSR. Okay, it sounds like everybody agrees on that front. I have one last argument in favor of the principle of sufficient reason that I want to throw open to you guys, because this is something that's not common or public. And not only does it say that the PSR is true, but that it's necessarily true. So let me hope I don't butcher this argument. But okay, so Proust kind of argues like, he says, look, let's suppose it's a reductio ad absurdum argument. So he says, let's suppose for the sake of argument that there's a possible world where the universe comes into existence without a sufficient cause or a sufficient reason or something, right? So, okay, great. We've supposed this for the sake of reductio. But then it's also possible, it's clearly possible that the universe would come into existence with a sufficient reason. That's not logically contradictory or logically impossible in any way. So there's another possible world where the universe comes into existence with a cause or with a sufficient reason. And so basically, then he says, well, why is there a difference? There has to be an explanation, something to do with something in that impossible world number two, where the universe comes into existence with a cause or with a sufficient reason, I should be saying, that differentiates it from the other world. So therefore, it does have a sufficient explanation. Something in world number two sufficiently explains, well, why the universe comes into existence with a sufficient reason, compared to world number one, where it doesn't. So it just ends in contradiction. The principle of sufficient reason has to be true, and it has to be true in every single possible world. I don't know if I butchered that or if that makes sense, but yeah, I'll start with you, Rich, this time. Did that make any sense? Or
it made some sense to me. To be honest, I'm not sure that off the cuff I can analyze the problems with it. So I would just say, at first pass, it seems okay. I'm sorry, I'm not doing a better analysis of
No, no worries. No,
that's definitely one that you got to think about. Like
Mhm.
I'd like to analyze. I'd like to see the objections to it and stuff
Mhm.
like that
Yeah.
before
right,
I could make a intelligent judgment on it.
okay, fair enough, fair enough. Okay, so with that said, let's put aside premise 1 and 2 and get to what we all want to talk about, premise 3, where we're saying that the explanation, sufficient reason or explanation of the universe, contingent existence of the universe, is God or God one, the God one hypothesis, as I call it. So there are three problems to overcome here. So maybe we can handle the first two just like very briefly. I'll just ask you guys your take on it. But the taxi cab fallacy, this is something that I find a ridiculous objection, to be honest. Like, oh well, the universe has to have a sufficient reason, and that sufficient reason is God. Well, what sufficiently explains God, or something like that. So I'll just throw it open. I'll start with you, David, this time. Do you think that that we're committing the taxi cab fallacy with the cosmological argument?
I think we discussed this in the Problem of Evil show, Rich, where the worst objection, one of the worst objections is, well, who calls God? No, yeah, I'm totally with you. I think it's a ridiculous one as well.
Yeah, in response to the arguments where God is especially deemed necessary, the response who caused God just simply isn't grappling with the argument.
Yeah. And one thing I'll just say quickly for the audience as well is, so obviously God is postulated to be necessary. So he exists out of the necessity of his own internal nature. So therefore the PSR is being upheld. We're not abandoning our explanatory principle in terms of God. He's just a different type of thing than the universe. The universe is contingent. God is necessary. But what if we had a watered down principle of sufficient reason? So not the one I give, but let's say it just says that every contingent thing has an explanation for its existence in an external cause or something. Okay, well, again, God is not a contingent thing, so the principle of sufficient reason just wouldn't apply to him. We're not abandoning the principle. It's just he's the type of thing that principle doesn't apply to. So yeah, this is just kind of a non-starter for me as an objection. So all right. I want to get your guys' take on the infinite regress problem. So obviously we kind of already discussed some philosophical arguments that allege to show that actual infinites are impossible. But maybe outside of that, what do you guys think of the infinite regress problem? Could there be an infinite regress of explanations or causes?
Well, it's not part of my critique to say that it's impossible, to say that it's possible. I honestly, I don't have a big opinion on that, because it really does get into some pretty abstruse philosophy, and it can include math and that kind of stuff like that, that I don't feel competent to really render a judgment on it. So it's the kind of thing where I can just say, so, okay, we'll go with that.
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah, David, what's your take?
Oh man, yeah, I think I said my piece earlier about infinite regresses. I hold the same position that you do on it. I think the philosophical arguments are very strong, and I think that even when you talk about the mathematicians and stuff like that, they truly give you a bird's, or not a bird's eye view, but a definitive view on what an infinity is versus what it is not. So and I can list you or read you some of the quotes like I did earlier, but that's where I stand, man.
All right. Let me ask this then. Let's pretend for a second actual infinites are possible. So let's take away those two philosophical arguments and say, yeah, you can have an infinite can be actualized. Do you still think that would be an option then, an infinite regress of explanations, or what do you think on that front?
I would be very suspect, first off, because I think from what, and this is just, we'd be living in a very different world if that was the case, I think. But I think, why am I not already at that point of entropy where like I don't exist anymore? And then you've got that whole idea of like, yes, we would be definitely living in a world where contradictions are prevalent. So at that point, what can I trust?
Awesome. And Rich, just want to throw that quick follow-up question to you.
Yeah, I guess it's hard for me to conceive of in any helpful, detailed way of what an infinite regress of explanations would look like. So I'm not sure how it would be pro or con. It's one of those things that just seems sort of hard to conceive to me.
Yeah, it would be in a different world. I mean, it would be an entirely different world if we could. I mean, it would be like totally different if you ask me.
Yeah, and so that's kind of like this is the traditional. I mean, going back to like Samuel Clarke, for example, in the 18th or 19th centuries, I think, and Richard Swinburne kind of picks up on this as well. So like even if there is an infinite chain, the question by saying that the universe is contingent is by nature requires, in order to be a sufficient explanation, we need a contrastive explanation in this case. Why is there something rather than nothing? Or why does this contingent universe rather than a different contingent universe? So in order to have a sufficient explanation, it has to be a contrastive one just by nature of the question. And that's where you can say, well, why this infinite chain versus another infinite chain or regress of causes? And that requires a sufficient explanation. Obviously, I might say as a theist, well, God chose to create this world, or chose to create in the question of something rather than nothing and stuff like that. So that's my sort of take is, in the first place, infinite regresses are impossible and logically absurd. Even if they were possible, it still doesn't address the issue. We still need a sufficient contrastive explanation for why this infinite chain over another one. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I don't think, oh, David, did you want to say? Oh, no.
I'm good.
All right, cool. So that's it. Now we can get straight into the part that I know everyone's waiting for, the gap problem. But just before I get into that, Rich, you kind of mentioned you had two objections you wanted to talk about, and you already kind of went with David about explanations. Is the special pleading, is that related to the gap problem, or is that something we haven't covered?
It is, yeah, and it kind of also arises out of the discussion of premise two, which is why I was getting at the reason that I view non-material supernatural explanations as having, they could be true, but appealing to them have liabilities, just as abandoning the principle of sufficient reason has liabilities, that I think should make us very careful about appealing to them. And I can sort of get into that if you want now.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
It's out to lunch, but
so yeah, so I mean the basic I do believe that this will bear on my concerns for the gap problem, especially that so a basic problem of explaining things, of trying to and including trying to determine cause and effect, are sort of variables, right? So just I guess coronavirus is on my mind, so I'll probably use those kind of things as examples here. But let's say you're at a party and sort of John comes in, and John has explains he has a sore throat, and people in this pandemic-strewn world sort of go, "Oh, he's got a sore throat." And I said, "Oh no, it's just my throat is a cold. It's just a common cold." And we asked John, "Well, why? How do you know that?" I said, "Well, common colds cause sore throats, so that's why I know it's just a common cold." But of course, the problem is, we point out, actually, but there are other diseases that cause sore throats too, the flu, but more worryingly, the coronavirus, right? So how do you rule that out? And if John just says back to us, "Well, I know it's the cold because you see common colds cause sore throats." What's the problem there? The problem there is that John isn't being responsible, or more specifically, he's not being epistemologically responsible, because there are other possible explanations for his sore throat, and he has not been responsible in ruling out those explanations or in providing additional argument to give better justification for his explanation over the other explanations. He could do that by appealing to additional arguments and evidence. For instance, like I had a PSR test and it came back negative, right? But there's always this problem of variables that you have to address in being epistemologically responsible. And that is not something tied conceptually to the material world, because as long as you have possible different causes, it's always a problem. So you could add in that there are, say, supernatural demons that cause sore throats as well, right? Well, then that's just another variable that you have to have ways of justifying any confidence in. As long as flus can cause sore throats, coronavirus or colds can cause sore throats also, you can't just, and introducing the supernatural doesn't solve this problem. If you posit you're even in an entirely supernatural immaterial realm, it's the same thing. So long as your experience so long as you are having experiences that you're trying to explain, so long as there are different possible causes of that experience, or so long as you can conjecture different possible explanations or hypotheses for that experience, you have this problem with variables, and you have to be epistemologically responsible. You can't just easily shove aside alternative explanations. The point of this being that it's a fundamental problem for explaining experience. That, and I haven't even mentioned the word science, I don't think, and for this to be a problem. But science is what grew out of that fundamental problem of variables and coming up with explanations. And it's been our long journey to finding what makes for a good explanation. And so, sorry, I should have lost
he could have a properly basic belief, that.
Yeah, there's probably, yeah. Yeah,
that was a shot at Dale, Rich. That was a shot at Dale.
But I mean, ultimately, we sort of arrive at that science is sort of our most epistemologically responsible method of investigating experience, I would say. So that's why we come up with explanations that are testable, that provide predictions, that are parsimonious, that are methodically double-checked by parties looking to prove them wrong, where explanations of our theories are fruitful in the sense of integrating with the rest of our knowledge, and therefore explaining more and more. So we have to be careful, I think, about going astray of some of the basic problems for explanations. Now, this is where I think a subset of explanations that the supernatural is a part of brings in these liabilities. So let me just give this example. And this I think bears on even these metaphysical attempts at explanations, I think. This is an explanation I actually mentioned on David's show, but it's the idea, for instance, I referred to Justin Brierley's and other theists appeal to a cosmological battle for explaining the existence of natural evil. So in other words, the free will defense for moral evil has to do with people must have been granted the ability to do good or bad in order to have morally relevant evil, but it doesn't seem to address the problem of natural evil, natural suffering, diseases, etc. So how do you do that? Some theists will say that you say, okay, there are other beings, say malign evil spirits, demons, etc., who could be behind natural evils such as disease, etc. And so they had to be granted free will, so God was letting them do their thing. Again, it's sort of a nutshell. But so the point of this is that once you posit that as a explanation for natural evils, then you're saying it's an explanation for instance, the current pandemic, the coronavirus. That's simply a natural evil. And so here's where you contrast the problem of supernatural explanation with a naturalistic explanation. So the naturalistic evolution explanation helps predict what a scientist in lab can hypothesize and what he can expect to see. And it does that by putting constraints on what is possible in the physical hypothesis. So the physical theory of evolution predicts the evolution of viruses and new variants, and it generally predicts how it can happen. But for instance, but it also puts constraints. So for instance, scientists studying the new Omicron variant in the lab can go home from work and return the next day confidently expecting that a sample of the virus has not suddenly grown a complex brain, arms, legs, sapience, because evolution theory puts constraints on this being possible. A virus by nature in evolutionary history just doesn't contain either the atavistic genes that could make that even possible, nor does it have the biological material that could make that possible. So it's the constraints on physical theory that allows the scientists to actually predict with and work with viruses and come up with vaccines, et cetera. But what would a supernatural explanation for these, say there's some sort of supernatural manipulation by supernatural agents causing diseases, what would that offer in its place? Well, it doesn't provide any mechanism to limit the supernatural powers. Therefore, it doesn't limit what these powers can achieve. Why shouldn't a biologist studying COVID expect to come back in the lab the next day and see results that are impossible via purely naturalistic evolutionary processes? For instance, far more complexity or sentience or anything that maybe a supernatural agent could have jigged up while he was gone. If you can't tell us how it is working, if you don't have some sort of explanation for the power and its limits, then the explanation is essentially compatible with anything you can observe. And therefore, that type of explanation doesn't actually explain any particular observation. And it's for this reason, it's this nature of explanations. Science isn't sort of a priori ruling out the supernatural. It's that the long haul of figuring out what makes for good and fruitful explanations has shown us this type of explanation it has liabilities. It's just like the PSR and banning the PSR's liabilities. And so it's just not a good explanation. I'll have to come back with something that can do more work with. And also sometimes I see theists use this sort of in the reverse. Like, so let's say Fred goes around poking his nose into all sorts of scientific mysteries, whatever that science hasn't explained right now. And every time he encounters one, he just says, well, my magic friend Blark caused it, right? And so he keeps going around solving all the scientific mysteries. He says, you see, this is the deficiency in materialistic explanations. They can't explain these things, but I can. Well, he's got the wrong end of the stick there, right? It's the very limitations of naturalistic explanations is what makes them powerful. Their constraints. Once you can explain anything via these supernatural things, you haven't really explained anything. So I think this starts to bear once you start trying to make your leap to your God, and when you start appealing to the supernatural as an explanation, immaterial minds. If your explanation, like supernatural explanations, are sort of like, I have a phenomenon X, I want to explain it, I will give Y the power to do X, therefore I've explained it. And if you haven't really explained how it actually does it, then it's functionally the same as sort of magic. There's supernatural magic neither really explains how it happens, but it has the power to do it. Once you open that Pandora's box, speculation can just be everything, and you can't really constrain it to just the single entity that you want to give this power to. You sort of cede that to any other explanation where you just say a miracle occurs or it's magic. So this will come, I think, will come to bear when you start to make the leaps to it has to be sort of an immaterial mind and these kind of things. And also when you want to say, for instance, it had to be the argument, for instance, it had to be a personal agent that had libertarian free will. I think that's just that will be, for instance, another instance where you're essentially giving something a magical power, and then I can give anything a magical power to do the same thing.
All right, cool. Yeah, so just before I turn it to you, David, just a couple clarifications for the audience. So I'm not sure that there's no distinction between properly basic beliefs and foundationalism. I mean, basic beliefs implies foundationalism. So I'm with you guys. I'm a foundationalist, but and also like the distinction between moral and natural evil. Just understand that depending on your theology, Like for example, or like young earth creationists with their theology, they might say that all natural evils are derivative from the moral evil at the fall or something like that. So that, there's some nuance there, but that has nothing to do with this debate. So yeah,
Yeah, you know what I was gonna say, Dale, was like, Rich, him and Ben, I didn't get to really comment in the problem of evil debate. The only time I was going to, I passed it on to Tyler to let my guests go first, and then next thing you know, I had to leave because I had to let other guests in. So I didn't get to really, yeah. There's people like me that, and a lot of people are not going to like my idea. I don't believe in a natural evil, which is I know is would be a shock to some people, but I've written papers on it on suffering and stuff like that, and I've concluded that I don't believe in natural evil in itself. So yeah, and that would take way too long of a rabbit hole to go down to today, but yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to talk to you guys again about some of those, but since I didn't get a chance to do anything with it, but yeah, so yeah, that show was huge. That was a huge show.
Yeah, I'm sure you.
Oh, I think you froze.
He did freeze.
Doesn't depend on even calling the diseases evil. It's just we're talking about the nature of the explanations.
Yeah, and we can go back and focus on that stuff too. So Dale, I mean, go ahead. You were in the middle of stuff.
I just want to turn it to you. So here's kind of Val's main point, and so I didn't know where he's going. I thought he was kind of saying like there's a top-down approach, like explanatory, like a God is like the best explanation compared for the contingency of the universe or something like that. But what do you make of what Val was saying about the nature, how we judge and adjudicate between which explanations are better?
I think it's a huge process. I think it should be a huge process, and I think Rich is quite right when he's telling us that we can't rule out variables. We have to be epistemologically responsible, and I think, and I've never understood this gap between the atheist and the theist. It could be starting points, it could be anything else, but it kind of, why, I guess it's hard for me to understand that, when somebody does do a thorough investigation, they still come back with this idea that it is a God. It's hard for both sides to kind of say, well, no, it can't be it should be this, and it should be it's a back and forth that has been prevalent through centuries. That I don't know the answer to why that is fully, but I would say that that the theist is making these let me just put it this way. If a theist is making these assumptions without a thorough investigation, then yes, I would say that if he's not examining the variables, Rich is right, he should be. But if he comes back with reasons, good reasons that he believes are good reasons, then I wouldn't discount those either. So I would say that if he has good reasons, like I think you did well in producing your cosmological argument. So I would turn the tables to you and say, hey, look, what did you present? And can we examine this? And did you actually consider all the variables? I don't rule out supernatural. I don't know why we just rule out a supernatural. I mean, as soon as we get into, I think, metaphysics and stuff, I think that could be implied if there's some implications that we deal with and we find are more convincing than not. So it's just that's just my take. But I'll turn it back to you, Dale. I don't really have anything else for it.
Yeah, cool.
May I say one more thing, Dale, quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so what I just discussed about the nature of explanations was essentially me just planting a flag, which I think will come to, like I said, bear on when we move on to trying to cross the gap to a God. But there's also, you have in your, is it premise 3 about establishing God one, and that sounds very reminiscent of when I was debating this or talking about this with Blake on David's show, where Blake seemed to want to defend a very minimalist account of God and to basically say that so long as the cosmological argument establishes some minimal characteristics associated with God, that's sort of good enough, or at least it's strong evidence for that God. And I've got something to say about that. Should I mention now, or you want to wait?
Yeah, go for it. We can cover that.
Right. So the the problem of the supernatural explanations in the Pandora's box was part of my response to that. You haven't really shut the box there enough to say, well, this is more pointing towards God than something else. So, for instance, like if let me see. Where are we? So I was looking for the minimalist. Just a second.
Definition. Oh, let me
Right. Yeah.
tell you what.
Just a second. Here we are. Yeah.
But you got it.
Oops. Sorry. Just 1 second here. Okay. I'll be just 1 second here. I just want to make sure I'm getting this right. Yeah. So like a minute, if you just if you say that you establish from a cosmological argument, say that the cause is eternal, say metaphysically necessary, external cause of the universe, and that's a God, that's an attribute that God has. So those are characteristics that we say God has. Therefore, we can say it was God because there's some evidence for God. The problem there is it's just too, it just is too minimal to even get there. So I think you can kind of see this if you, in a thought experiment, if you reverse the scene, instead of being us being sort of physical beings speculating about a non-material outside time and space system causation, flip it and imagine we are not all completely non-material beings in a completely non-material scenario, speculating about physical causes. And let's just say that there's a phenomenon X, and somebody's come up with an argument, and John again, say all John's argument manages to establish is that it was a physical cause, that is a cause taking place within a sort of time and space. Like, oh, that's an interesting idea. But also John wants to say, and therefore it was a cat, where he sort of glommed on some extra features on there, say whatever, it purrs, has whiskers, has claws, just a few features, and he's calling it a cat. And that's the type of physical entity it was. Well, the problem is, since we exist in the physical universe, we know how deficient that is. Because yes, as it turns out, in a real physical universe, cats have the characteristics of being causal and part of time and space, but so do almost countless other entities. They share that feature, but countless other dissimilar entities, from sentient to non-sentient, share that same characteristic, and they're nothing like cats. Everything from every molecule in the universe to fire to earthquakes, so everything. So the leap that, well, I've established this basic characteristics, which I associate with cats, it doesn't come anywhere close to actually establishing that it's evidence that a cat did it. It could be evidence of any other physical entity somebody else can dream up, and that actually, as it turns, exists in the real world. But it's even worse than that, because if you take non-physical beings speculating about what could be physical causes, they could also end up speculating physical causes that aren't actually feasible physical causes. So, I mean, you can have somebody speculating that, there are human beings that can fly unaided, or speculating about things that are just impossible to evolve. There's all sorts of things that are possible physically, but there's all sorts of things that are impossible physically. So the non-physical beings may end up even speculating about a physical cause that it turns out isn't even possible in the physical realm. And in the same way, if we're physical beings and we're speculating about what's possible in the non-material realm, if we're positing minds, that kind of stuff, it could even be possible that yes, minds are disembodied minds are possible, as are sort of countless other entities are possible, or it could be that other entities in fact are possible, and it will turn out that in the non-physical realms, minds aren't possible. So what I'm saying is it's just such incredible speculation to try and say that even if something shares the attribute of being sort of non-physical outside time, space, and the cause, that this is enough to establish, it's evidence for God. There's too many, we just don't know enough. There's too many other logically possible entities that that are sentient, that you can give the attribute of causing the universe, that are not like a God.
Yeah, so, and obviously this is why I purposely said I'm arguing for the truth of the God one hypothesis. And, I kind of explain it's going to be a cumulative case. I'm ultimately going to be arguing for what I call the God final hypothesis when everything's said and done. And even with the God final hypothesis, it's not going to be proving God the being. It'll prove like a lot of attributes and stuff like that, but it's not going to prove the Trinity, for example, or at least I don't plan to, right? And that's why I go into arguments for Christianity, blah blah blah. So you're absolutely right that the cosmological argument in isolation is very limited, and in fact, even my cumulative case, just based on natural theology, even that will be limited. Even that won't be God the being in all of its fullness.
Yes, but note that it's typically called the cosmological argument for God.
Yeah, but Rich,
Sure.
Just to be fair, when I said, does God fit the bill? I'm hoping that you don't look at it as just a singular argument that proves God, but you're looking at it at the overall picture of why the theist thinks God fits the bill, kind of thing, versus, I don't even think, so
okay, so you went to supplemental arguments, basically.
Yeah, well, it definitely is part of a cumulative case, right? I mean, I think it would be irresponsible if we just used that argument, like I said earlier, as the sole argument. If that's the only one we have, then I would agree. I mean, we're in trouble.
Yeah, it did seem to me that on your show that, unless I misunderstood, Blake was actually saying that it was good enough to show the theistic hypothesis has evidence over that the God hypothesis has evidence over an alternative. And I was trying to explain why I didn't think it even did that.
What I was gathering is the God hypothesis takes into consideration, other things too. And that's, like I said, it's a broad spectrum, but I don't think singularly. I don't know.
Okay, we're on the same.
I think we're on the same page. Yeah.
So let me say this then. So, okay, great. So there are three different things I want to say. So in the first place, David's right? Like Rich is right when he said Blake had a different approach than me. Mine is more of a bottom-up approach. His was more like top-down, kind of saying like, which we have the theistic hypothesis, and then we have the atheistic hypothesis, and we have this explanandum, which was the beginning of the universe. The universe began to exist. That was his cosmic fact. And then he, based on predictions, he was saying, well, the conditional probability is higher that the theist would create that. The universe would begin to exist on theism rather than atheism. And believe it or not, I thought Blake raised a lot of good points, but I actually agreed more with Rich's point. I think that Blake can establish that on theism, it does predict that the universe would begin to exist, or at the very least on Christian theism. But I was hoping for a little bit more from Blake about, well, what about on atheism says that it predicts that the universe wouldn't begin to exist. So that was kind of a weakness that I noticed there. But you can argue from the top down thing and try to argue what is the best. But if you're
I think Dale, I even think that entails a certain fact about God that you would have to come at with to even form the hypothesis, so I think there has to be some considerations you have to even consider before you even form that hypothesis.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that's where I think Blake was coming from. I don't think he's just like saying, "Oh, I'm just going to posit a supernatural being I know nothing about." No, I mean, you can't even have a hypothesis that way. I mean, you can't. And that's where Rich would be completely correct. If that's where someone is coming from, then they're being irresponsible with variables or being irresponsible with their epistemology in general. Like, there's a reason we say God, we think God is the best explanation. And there's a hypothesis, whether it's through our experiences where we have an experience with God, and that could be the big disconnect that the atheist has with the Christian, is because we believe we've actually experienced God, and we experience those attributes and we've seen them in the world, and we see, we come at it from a different way.
Cool.
So, that could be the big disconnect, but I don't think it's any less reasonable, because I think we're trying to figure out the fundamentals of reality. I think once all those variables are given, I think that would satisfy Rich to say, you know what, you can posit it and you can walk away with a reasonable conclusion, even if I think you're wrong.
Okay, awesome. Okay, cool. So yeah, okay, great. That makes sense, kind of thing. But even if we didn't take the top down, there is that bottom up, which is the approach that I'm taking. So like, just taking this argument in isolation, I mean, a enormously powerful, necessary being that sufficiently explains the universe is spaceless, timeless, non-physical, and is personal. Let's pretend that's all I could prove. Even that is amazing for an atheist. I mean, such a personal being is, in and of itself, yeah, it's might be not enough to say, well, is it Allah? Is it the Christian God? Is it some general theist God? Or is it some other personal being that's necessary and stuff like that? Nonetheless, what we have established is a huge step forward in our cumulative case. And the last thing I wanted to add there is, I also argue in my thing, I know you both hate properly basic beliefs, but fine, forget the terminology. But on the foundation, it's possible that someone could, on this foundation, once they prove this, then that spurs within them this intuition or properly basic belief, resulting in knowledge that that thing is God, that being is God. And I think this is what, maybe I'm reading into it a bit, but maybe that's what Thomas Aquinas had in mind.
I would just, the only thing I would jump back on that, Dale, is like, where do you ground that?
Ground
the properly, those ideas. I just don't see a way that you can actually show that you can ground that. That's all.
Nor can you give reason for the other person to accept your premises, your argument.
It's just got a lot of issues, I think, with it. That's why I really promote the foundationalism, but that's just me. I think it could solve the regress problem, but
what am I denying in foundationalism? I don't even understand what you're saying.
I didn't say you're denying foundationalism, but when you started talking about properly basic beliefs, the reason that me and Rich have such a problem with them is because of grounding and what he just said. Well,
the grounding is that I haven't gotten into the arguments yet, but I've supposedly established that there is a being with these properties that is the explanation of the universe. And on that foundation, that's the grounding that induces within me a properly basic belief that is God. I mean, beliefs can induce other beliefs and stuff like that, right? It's not just experiences and stuff like that. Like non-factive experiences are usually what we ground it in, like you see something or whatever, but beliefs also can induce other beliefs, right?
Yeah, I just think that would be a whole separate argument of, does he actually ground those properly basic beliefs, and does it, is it possible at that point? It could be, but is it probable? I don't know how you show that grounding. That's pretty much what I would say.
And like I said, if you come to the end of a sort of a train of argument and you say, and then for the leap part to the conclusion, you say, and then I have a properly basic belief that the conclusion I want to get to is the case. Well, if you just accept that okay for you, even if you accept that properly, basically for you, you haven't provided any reason for the other person to accept your argument. So I'll just keep repeating that. But
that's true. Yeah.
If I don't have that properly basic belief, then your argument isn't going to convince me. And if it's not, then what are we doing?
Yeah, exactly. The properly basic belief bit. I don't see an issue with the grounding, so maybe I need to like think what you guys are saying. I think it is grounded, but yeah, it wouldn't be persuasive. Even if it was grounded, it wouldn't be persuasive to someone else who doesn't share that. So that's why, okay, great. Let's focus in on what I think is objectively demonstrable. Let's just focus on that minimal foundation. And I know that the key thing that, just out of curiosity, Rich, with all of the, is it of the ones I mentioned, is it just kind of the personal agent, which is linked to the free will aspect, that you find problematic? Or
well, I like to go through them to see which ones I might have a problem with, and I can certainly, one leaps out, the inference that the cause of the universe must have been enormously powerful. I went over this on with Blake as well, but I wouldn't mind sort of getting that one out of the way.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's pretty standard, and William Lane Craig likes to do it, to say it as well, that once you've established that the universe had a cause, well, my gosh, it's just so incredible and overwhelming, this idea of what could have caused a massive universe. It must have been something incredibly, outstandingly powerful, and that's an attribute that, of course, theists associate with God. So you want to get that attribute in there. It's incredibly powerful. But I don't see any reason to accept this inference, because number one, it's not logically necessary. That a simple cause had a complex, the proposition that a simple cause had a complex effect, or that a weaker cause had a powerful effect, is not a logical contradiction. And then if we're looking for, well, then where do we get this inference from? If we're looking from our empirical experience, well, then there's all sorts of examples from our empirical experience that suggests that large or powerful or complex effects don't necessarily come from equally large, powerful causes. In fact, they often trace to very simpler effects or simpler entities. So I've used the example of the coronavirus, the pandemic. The pandemic seems to be an extremely powerful thing, a powerful effect. It's basically sort of rendered the world to its knees. It's kept us in lockdown for years off and on. It's a huge effect on the world. But if you trace back the causal chain, what you actually end up with is just a mutation occurring in a pathogen. I mean, that mutation basically started a cumulative effect that ended up in a very powerful effect. But the entity at the beginning of that chain was a very simple, and there's no reason to call that entity incredibly powerful. Things can have cumulative sort of causation. And all through scientific explanations, even from the explanation of evolution, for instance, when people look at the world and think, oh my gosh, how did this ecology just get there as it was? How did this thing that seems so complexly designed just arise? It must have taken some great intelligence and great power to put it together. But then the evolutionary explanation traces it back to ever simpler forms and simpler entities, where you don't need this big, complex, or super powerful cause. And that just keeps going on. There's even the problem with AI, right? There's the worry among computer sciences that artificial intelligence can reach the sort of event horizon where it becomes more intelligent than us. And this is a serious concern. And that eventually, in becoming more intelligent than us, it eventually becomes more powerful, and worries it could essentially escape, as it were, and essentially dominate human beings by its greater knowledge and power, et cetera. And like I said, this is a serious concern among computer scientists, but that would be a feasible example of less powerful beings creating more powerful beings. And then once again, the universe itself, the origin of the universe itself also seems to have come along this principle. If you say, oh my gosh, how did all these intricate galaxies and everything in the universe come to be? It must have been something complex or powerful, enormously powerful that created it. Well, it turns out if you trace back the origins of the universe, the Big Bang sort of explanation, it becomes ever simpler to an ever more dense point where there wasn't galaxies in there. There wasn't all the complexity, the size of the universe in there. It traces back to a much simpler entity. And it's so much simpler that leads to even cosmologists and physicists hypothesizing that, it could have arisen out of, say, quantum foam or that kind of thing. Now, whether those physical arguments, whether those scientific arguments or hypotheses are true or not at work, the point is that the fact that the complex universes traces to a simpler and not super powerful beginning is just another explanation. So I don't see anything logically that entails that it has to be an enormously powerful cause of the universe, nor does our empirical experience say that it necessarily must be extremely powerful.
Okay, all right, David. So yeah, Rich wanted to focus on the element that comes directly, that I think is directly entailed from the cosmological argument, that whatever this cause of the universe is, it's enormously powerful. And he was saying, no, that can accumulate and emerge, kind of thing, from simpler or less powerful causal chains. So yeah, like, what do you make about that? Do you think that the cosmological argument proves that this being is powerful, enormously powerful?
Well, as far as of course, I think I side with you on this one. I would like to hear your explanation of why again, so I can critique that. So I was actually, I got distracted while Rich was doing his explaining because the wife was getting a hold of me because we got some stuff to do here soon. So I'm not gonna be able to stay on forever. But yeah, so I had to part out. But as just as an initial, yes, I do think to create reality in general, I think it would be that a being would have to be enormously powerful. But I think Rich did give a good explanation why he doesn't think so. So I'd like to hear your critique on it.
Yeah. So I still think, like, I can even recognize what he's talking about, rather than saying like, oh, well, there's this iterativeness postulate whereby something has the power to gain the power or something like that. That's the same as having the power. So like, in a way, you could try to argue that you would have, in order for these things to accumulate, that still requires the first cause to be enormously powerful to set up the system that way. But I think the way that I kind of argue it is, rather than looking at like, oh, to make a galaxy, God directly did that, he had to be enormously powerful or something like that. I would more just look at the initial state of the universe, and based on the properties of that initial state itself, suggest that this cause would have to be enormously powerful in order to cause that. And it would directly need to have those causal potentials to bring that state of affairs into actuality. So
I don't, it just doesn't seem entailed. I mean, as I said, that's the greater simplicity of the early universe is, once again, scientists see that as justifying hypothesis of pretty simple and not enormously powerful, and certainly not all powerful entities possibly causing the universe. I'd also mention just about the iterative power idea, that whatever maybe was at the beginning of the causal chain had essentially the inherent powers of the causal chain. I mean, the problem is that can apply just as easily to anything that starts the chain. So it could apply to the mutation of a virus that started the chain that became the enormously powerful pandemic. I don't think anybody's going to call a single mutation enormously powerful.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So I know that David is pressed for time, so I want to make sure we have.
I do want to say that once we dive into the realm of implications from a cosmological argument, and this is why I would want to supplement my argument with the whole Thomistic approach. This is where I think that the implications when the implications come in, you can now incorporate or you could do it throughout the premises. I don't know, but I haven't really developed it yet. But I'm working on it. But I do think that this is where if you're going to start giving the implications, you have to give solid reasons why there's implications. You'd have to do supplementary arguments to show those implications true. So, or show that those, the implications are justified. So, like, if he's enormously powerful, you're going to have arguments for that.
Awesome.
Right.
Do you mind my asking before David goes? I'm not turning this into a different discussion. I'm just simple, quick question. As far as Thomistic arguments, do you also go in for the arguments for morality, natural law, etc., or do you appeal to different types of arguments?
I usually take an approach for moral realism, and
Okay.
I usually use a variety of sources when it comes to the moral argument on moral realism. So I would also cite people like Moore and Brink, and other famous philosophers. Yeah. So I vary. I try to find the best explanation. So that for cosmology, I think the Thomistic view does really well with these implications. So, and once I'm able to develop it, I would call it, maybe the modified Kalam, but because I don't know if I would be able to. I might be able to use contingency. I don't know, but we'll see.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
All right, cool. So just before I do want to cover, obviously, the most important thing is that personal agent. So I want to make sure I fit that in before we have to go. So, okay, so I'll start us off then. So I gave multiple arguments for why I think that this cause of the universe has to be, and or explanation of the universe has to be either a person or personal. And so I'm going to give three. I'm going to condense down to just three kind of thing, easy ways to do it. So the first one would be kind of based on the types of explanations that one can give. So, Richard Swinburne famously breaks it up. Well, there are scientific explanations. Well, that wouldn't work because we're trying to explain all of the natural reality, all of physical reality, space and time, and all of its contents. So that wouldn't work. Neither would appeal to at least the physically consistent multiverse. If you want to go into multiverse theories and stuff like that, those wouldn't work because those would be included in what a universe is. So scientific explanations wouldn't work. Then there are personal or agential explanations. Okay, God is a person. He made a free will decision to create, so he's an agent, and through agent causation, he did it. There are also conceptual explanations. So Swinburne doesn't get into this, but this kind of says like, well, abstract things exist in some kind of Platonic realm and they caused the universe. And, those don't work because abstract entities don't stand in causal relations. I don't think it's implausible for a Platonic realm of abstract things to exist concretely. So these would be reasons I would take that. There is a fourth option, which kind of straddles the conceptual type explanation, but it doesn't have to. And this is based on a metaphysical principle of some sort, or, like, for example, karma might be a metaphysical principle or something like that, but it has to be of a special sort. And philosophers John Leslie and Rescher have proposed this thing called the principle of optimalization, which says that the best of all worlds has to be real, has to exist in some way. And they could appeal to this as a metaphysical principle or some kind of thing that brings this state of affairs about. And on that front, again, I have problems with that. I don't think that makes sense in terms of it being, if it's an abstract principle. There's no reasons to believe that this metaphysical principle is true outside of assuming God exists already. And also, even if it is true, even if I grant the atheists this principle, well, the best of all possible worlds would have a being like God. So you would prove that God exists. So this means that the best explanation has to be, the only one that works is a personal explanation. Do you guys want me to give all three now, or do you guys want to respond to each?
Well, Oh, sorry. Well, I heard things in there. There's this Swinburne division between scientific and personal explanations. And you did mention, didn't you also mention libertarian free will, or have you not got there yet?
I referenced it, but it's not, I
Referenced
didn't
it.
give the argument about that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So can I just jump in on Swinburne's thing?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. And so it's like this division between scientific and personal explanations or agential explanations seems to sort of, to me, essentially beg the question against naturalism. Because all personal agents I've ever seen are physical and cannot cause anything without doing so physically. And going to the old egg boiling in the pot example, where it can be explained via physics, but also be explained by personhood, by a decision to boil an egg. You can say that there's an explanation in the reason I had for boiling the egg, but it doesn't seem from experience a sufficient reason explanation for the egg boiling, because every agential causal personal causation that I can reliably document, it entails me or anybody else physically putting the egg in a pot of water, turning on the stove, the fire, physically heating the water, et cetera. So you don't get to just skip all the demonstrable physical phenomena associated with observed agent causation just by appealing to reason alone. That's where you just essentially rule out agent causation as a subset of scientific or physical explanation. So it just seems to me to entirely beg the question. I don't see any reason to accept this division. It seems to automatically posit they are different things.
David, what do you make of that argument and that distinction there?
I think it comes down to like the whole idea of what Aristotle posited in the first place, and then is grown from there. It's just we come at it from different starting points. I think for one, I do agree that the only immaterial causal realities we know of are that of the intentions of a personal agent. So I would think that okay, so if this cause that would be personal agent, because it's hard to explain. I don't have it written up right here, but I would think that it is personal because of that. I agree with your position, but from what Rich was saying, I think it really has to do with where we're at, what we're coming at, why we think there's an agent involved in the first place. I do think we have to, for us to have a hypothesis, we have to have an idea of what this agent is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's kind of like where I'm at.
Cool. All right. So just to give my kind of quick response on this argument then. So I don't think it begs the question necessarily for, in favor of like substance dualism. Persons aren't physical or something like that. We could just remain agnostic on that question, right? So if the atheist says, no, they actually do reduce down to scientific explanations, that's the atheist begging the question. He'd have to provide proof for that. But if we just remained neutral on that, we avoid begging the question and we say, well, there are these things called personal explanations, and we don't know whether they reduce down to scientific or physical explanations or not. And you could just leave it at that, and that would kind of work. Yeah, as long as you leave it agnostic, then you could still make that distinction. I see. Your second objection, I think, is interesting. I think it's true, right? When we, I wouldn't say that they're reduced to it, but for example, when we appeal to personal explanations like why is this craft dinner burning or cooking or something like that, it's true that they do usually correlate with scientific explanations, right? Well, I'm cooking because I want dinner, but I have to physically put the stuff in there and stuff like that. Yeah, I guess I would just want to see, I would need to see proof from like the atheist to say that that's a necessary correlation, that personal explanations can't operate in the absence of accompanying physical mechanisms and stuff like that. And just because that's okay, he's got to go. So, so yeah, in a nutshell, that's sort of my response there.
Okay, I would say to that though that I sort of supplied some brief reasons to think that intentions alone, intentions alone can't be an explanation of in our normal experience of agents can't explain things. So, for instance, if you could, like I said, if one of us wants to boil an egg, we may have the intention to boil an egg, but that egg is not going to boil via our intentions. We're always going to have to physically go and boil the egg. If you could show me, and that's always seems to be the case, if you could show me just intentions themselves being causal and skipping this physical process, well, then you'd have, if you could, with your mind, boil an egg, then you'd have some evidence that intentions themselves are sort of this divisible thing, and that you can appeal to intentions and not to the physical. But until you can do that, which I don't think you can, it just seems that the physical seems necessary for agents to fulfill their intentions. And so there is this apparent mind-body dependency in that way. And I think our regular experience of being in the world continually reinforces this.
Basic actions prove that. Then you could appeal to basic actions, which all philosophers of action recognize, and that sort of thing, right? So you make an intention in your soul, and it just immediately manifests as a basic action physically. Whatever that first step to like lift your finger. Obviously, there's a physical process of C fibers, neurons, whatever it is, kind of thing. But that immediate first physical instantiation, that's just a basic action from soul to that state. So there are examples that.
I don't know that you just actually made an argument that it was non-physical. I mean, like it's still, that's still coherent within a physical explanation. So I'm not really sure what that's getting you.
Well, it's establishing the plausibility that there's an immaterial soul or person. By appealing to basic actions, it just manifests that physical thing without need to appeal. It sufficiently explains that first state, that first event that pops up.
So you're saying, for instance, you appeal to a soul. Well, first one, like I said, it still seems to be also coherent with the naturalistic explanation, where the soul just seems gratuitous. And number two, you get right into the mind-body problem and the causal problem of positing the immaterial intentions or immaterial mind, right? So it's a classic thing of, it seems rather strange that, on a purely physical conception, the fact that my intentional powers end at my body, that I can only manipulate my body or the world through my body, makes perfect sense because it's limited in that way. But once you posit that our thoughts that guide our actions and our mind is non-physical, it seems very strange that it suddenly, for some reason, this just happens to end at my fingertips, as it were, right? If the non-physical can cause the material to do things, well, what's the difference between the molecules of the air around my fingertips versus on my fingertips? They're essentially the same. There's no reason to expect that if minds were immaterial and can cause matter to behave, that your mind couldn't simply cause a light bulb to go on and off or to boil egg. It's very strange, where it's not strange on a natural conception that our powers are limited to our body and having to use our body to manipulate the world.
Gotcha. Okay, so I just got thank you for that. I just got a message. So yeah, I do think David Russell needs to head off. He's busy, so I do want to try to wrap things up. But I want to give at least this personal thing. I had two other arguments I wanted to go. So maybe if I can just end it and let both of you kind of respond to both of those arguments quickly in the next like 5 minutes, 10 minutes or so. Is that okay, David? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool. So The second argument is the one that I gave with T-jump based on libertarian free will that basically says, look, if the whatever was created or caused the universe to exist was a necessary physical, non-personal thing that didn't have free will, libertarian free will, well, then the effect would necessarily be eternal. But we have proven that the universe, be necessary. But we've proven that the universe is not eternal, and or at the very least, it is contingent and not necessary. So that in itself proves that we have to appeal to some kind of mechanism where there was a dual ability, and that's libertarian free will. So God, through his free will, could either create, which he did, or he could choose to refrain from creating, even though all of the necessary and sufficient conditions causally are present to create the universe. So that proves that there has to be some kind of libertarian free will personal agent as the explanation. So that's the first argument in a nutshell. The last argument that I wanted to get your take on is kind of like the quantum consciousness type thing. So Tara, Anthony 66, those guys appeal to this, and they say, well, there's this primacy of consciousness that's required for the quantum phenomena to take place and stuff like that. So that suggests that there needs to be a personal consciousness that created all of physical reality and all at the quantum level, all of its foundational building blocks and stuff like that. So I'll shut up. David, I'll let you answer that first, what you think about those two arguments.
Right on. Well, first, I just wanted to piggyback on the whole agent thing real quick, because I think that was probably I think that's one of Rich's strongest points, because it's based off of experience, and we don't understand the full nature of consciousness and reality, but our experience says this. And I think that that's probably the strongest argument, and that's one that I would also look into even more to get more of a solid foundation on what I believe about it, I do think it's a strong point, because we experience ex materia causation, stuff like that. I think there's something in the philosophy about it applying to an agent, but I have to agent outside of time and space. I'd have to look into it and to see if it's a conversation that would have to I think it's a whole nother conversation we'd have to get into. I think these implications are way too much to cover on the one show, and start thinking about going over each implication, have a show for each. But as far as quantum consciousness stuff, I think it's very fascinating. I think it's that whole idea, the digital physics argument. I think it's fascinating, and it's an idealist argument. I think that if we look at it, it's very interesting, and that's all I could say about it. I don't have all the facts for it, nor did I prepare for them, so I don't want to be able to give an argument that I'm not going to be able to back up. But I do think it's fascinating, and I think that it could lend a lot of credence to the argument if we find out more on quantum physics and stuff like that. I think it's very interesting. Let's just put it that way. On the freedom argument, of course, I agree with you about libertarian free will. I'm not a just one of these weird compatibilist guys that just hang around all day. And no, I do believe on libertarian free will. I do like your take on it. This is in how you apply it to this argument, I haven't fully looked into, so I won't be able to touch on it much, but from what I see so far, I don't have a problem with what you came up with. And listening to these in the past, like I said, there's so much there. Honestly, even though I've listened to these, all your arguments and stuff like that, and I told you I have to go back over them because they're that entailed, and I didn't know about your written PDFs on them. So I would love to actually maybe go over some more of this again sometime with you.
Sounds good. Yeah, cool. Sorry, we got kind of pressed there at time, but Rich, I will let you have the last word out of respect for Yeah, go for it. What do you think?
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry that we reached this point just now, because really this is where I was hoping to get to early on, and why I planted that early flag about the nature of explanations and the problem with supernatural.
You guys could keep going. That's fine with me.
Okay.
It's up to Rich. I'm happy to do whatever you want.
I don't mind sticking around for this point, but maybe I can make it quickly. And if David wants to, or maybe David's gone.
I think he just left. Yeah.
Okay. So the libertarian free will explanation to get to a personal being, right? So as I think you basically sort of mentioned, or it's been often put, right? It's sort of to solve a problem that if you're positing a cause that's outside time and space, then you can't really point to, if there's no time t at which the cause wasn't causing the universe. And if that's the case, the causes exist exists eternally, and as a necessary and sufficient cause, etc., it would be causing the universe eternally. And so the universe should be eternal, but the universe isn't eternal via the scientific evidence, and it can't be eternal via other philosophical arguments. So therefore, you have to give this cause this power to be a cause that exists outside time and space, and yet have the power to cause universes. And as you would also put it, to refrain from causing a universe, or say, for instance, decide not to cause a universe, and then decide to cause a universe. And at that point, you would enter into time. It's a theistic take often. So now here's the problem of magic. When you're positing libertarian free will, this is where I believe you sort of sneak in the, and then a miracle happens, or just something that is functionally magic, and that opens the Pandora's box. So if you're going to appeal to an explanation, it's either going to be because it's a live option, it's something known to be able to cause X, or you're postulating a new possible cause for X that, if was true, would cause X. So in other words, like if I came down and found my peanut butter sandwich was gone from my table, my dog is known to grab sandwiches from the table. So in that way, since that's already a known cause, I can appeal to that known cause. I can appeal to the causation of dogs that we already know about eating sandwiches. But if I say posit a supernatural cause, or some sort of cause that is generally we don't know causes sandwiches to disappear, well, I can say, well, but if I posit this supernatural thing to have the power to make sandwiches disappear, well, then I've explained it. Well, that's the problem with insufficient explanations. And once you open that up, you can make up any number of supernatural entities that are different, or any entity that just give it the power to do so. And now you've, quote, explained it when you haven't really explained much. So when you appeal to libertarian free will, either you can show that libertarian free will is a thing, it's a live option, it's occurring, we know it exists, and therefore we can use this as an explanation for sort of a causal explanation. In which case you have to be able to demonstrate, for instance, that agents like us or something are making contra-causal and are engaged in contra-causal behaviors in this physical universe. I don't see any demonstration of that, or any way you can even demonstrate it. So then it seems that you're left with, well, if we posit this libertarian free will, which is essentially the power to cause a universe while being outside of time, and then that, well, if we posit that would explain it, well, that is the sort of appeal to magic. And you can posit really anything if you just give it the magic power to cause a universe while being outside of time. I could sort of just posit anything, like a non-sentient entity. We could just even sort of call it a force, or we could give it a name like Blark. It's non-sentient, but it has the characteristic of being able to cause universes outside time and space. That is to be not causing at some point and then cause at some point. Well, how does it do this? Well, it just has that power. And if I posit it, well, that would explain how the universe came into existence. Well, you're doing the same thing with libertarian free will. If I ask, really, how does it have that power? it seems to me your explanation is going to be, well, it's not a mechanistic explanation. I can't explain really how it works, but you got to pause it because if it's true, that would explain it. So like I'm saying, it's like a non-explanation that opens the Pandora's box to any countless other entities that are not a god, that you just give this power to cause universes outside time and space by some non-material way.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and so yeah, obviously I would disagree. We've gone over the libertarian free will debate on other shows, but one follow-up question on that one then. So let's pretend you're totally right. This libertarian free will explanation doesn't work. It's nonsense or something. What else would there be? Because you recognize the problem. The necessary and sufficient conditions are there for all of eternity. I mean, what possibly could explain the existence of the universe? You can't just say, well, it exists inexplicably. I mean, how do we have this contingent universe then, if not free will?
So my view on this is that I just want to have the humility to say that we just don't know, and at this point can't know. And I think the speculation is just too open to even. I just don't think it. I don't know the answer, but I don't think that theists can have the confidence many seem to have in their answers. That's basically it. I don't know, and I don't think the theist knows either. Nor do I think that theists can have the confidence he seems to have, even though he may not claim to have absolute knowledge about it. He thinks that that theists will say, well, I've got good reasons to think that this is the cause. I just think that I think this field of speculation is just not constrained enough to give you that confidence.
Okay, and last question, follow-up question on this argument. And let's pretend pretend my arguments did persuade you, and you think that libertarian free will is a thing, and so it is plausible. We have it, kind of thing. Would the theist then still be justified in saying, well, in appealing to that as the explanation? So it's plausible as a hypothesis, or do you still think, yeah, but you're not able to rule out other options? So you've got the libertarian hypothesis, and then we have unknown hypotheses, but you don't have a right to go, yeah, I think it's probably libertarian is the best explanation.
Okay, so that's a very good question. If it was somehow known or demonstrated that libertarian free will, this contra-causal power existed, I suppose it would become an option for an explanation, and I would have to think about this more, but I still have the feeling that that there's so much other speculation. You're just reaching a realm where there's so much other speculation where you can posit other things with the power to cause the universe that it's just not constrained enough. I think maybe it gives more heft to it, but I'm not sure it does enough. So I don't really have a firm answer for that question. It's a good question.
All right, cool. And yeah, I guess just to kind of end off, what are your, we're probably, I know that you're going to be disappointed because it's so short, but I'm willing, if you guys want to do like another one just focused on these issues, like with David Russell or something, you guys let me know and I'll be there for you guys. But just to end off this show, I'm interested. What do you make of the quantum consciousness argument? This is an argument that I myself haven't really cared to look into in detail, but I know it's out there. People like Keith Ward have argued it, and I've encountered it. But yeah, this primacy of consciousness, is there anything to this, or what do you make of that?
Well, I'm not sure that what I was saying would really directly respond to precisely that argument. Like, for instance, I mean, if you're sort of talking about something that arises from, say, some scientists think, and you mentioned in your previous video, that due to things like the wave collapse upon observation, that consciousness might be a fundamental aspect of reality itself. It's just hard to really parse out what that could mean, and especially what it would mean even for the personal God. I mean, it doesn't seem to even fall from that God God exists, or that even God would be some personal agent. And just the very concept is like, how does it make sense of the apparent non-sentient character of so many physical things? So, if you argued the non-personal, non-sentient consciousness of the sort we're familiar with is sort of incoherent, then why don't phenomena like earthquakes and evaporation, fire, falling things, etc., exhibit the traits we associate with consciousness? Why don't we see them deciding to act differently and doing so? It seems to be an aspect of non-sentience or non-consciousness in this way that actually is part of what explains our predictable explanations of apparently non-sentient forces in physical things. It's why you don't drop a rock off the top of a tall building to a crowd below, expecting the rock can just choose on the way down to alter its path and not hit anybody. So in a way, sort of just a parsimony thing. It's like looking at the patch of a wild growing field in a field, and it's strewn with shrubbery and rocks and dirt, etc. And it looks like any other patch of wild field. And you can posit that there's an actual gardener creating that patch so that it looks indistinguishable from what would grow naturally, like everything else around it. But the more parsimonious take is that it's simply what it looks like, an unintended bit of field. So likewise, it just seems sort of more parsimonious that when physical objects, certain physical objects act as we'd expect of non-sentient objects, non-conscious objects, that they are non-sentient or non-conscious, and which is how we should treat them until some theory makes better predictions using the idea that they're conscious.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, I think, yeah, I think that covers it. Are there any other issues that we didn't get to discuss, but you feel are really important that you want to take some time to discuss at all? Or
let's see. Yeah, there's fine tuning, but I don't think you placed much on that. And then there's the thing when you said abstract concepts or numbers, whatever, can't cause things. I believe they don't stand in causal relation to things. I think that's what you said. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I would rule out conceptual explanations.
Yeah, not that I have like a knockdown argument against that, but it sort of strikes me as I could just sort of wonder why could one accept that if you're positing disembodied immaterial minds stand in causal relation to things. I don't see any reason to think that's established any more than that numbers can or can't cause things. So if you're sort of going to say numbers can't cause things, but then go on to say, but a disembodied mind can, I don't think you've really established much difference between the two there. But I think we kind of already covered some of that ground, because you've actually you've given sort of some reason to think that minds are non-material and causal. But I would have made that point.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's a good point. All right, awesome. Yeah, I really liked this show. I know it went on a little bit longer than you guys wanted it, but no, I think I really like these shows, getting your guys' opinions, like and learning and trying to grow and improve my reasoning and argument. So like, the one thing that I really liked in this show is that correlation point you made about the difference between scientific and personal explanations. That's something I need to really think about and work on in order to hammer home that argument if I'm going to keep using it. So yeah, this has been helpful. I hope you enjoyed the conversation on your end there.
No, it's always helpful for me too. I gets me thinking about my things. I don't know that I'm right, so it's always good to have these discussions.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, with that said, I think I will end it at this point. And next week, I might break this up into 2 parts just because it's long. But yeah, the following week, I'll go back to finishing off my Shroud solo show for you guys in the audience. I know got a lot of Shroud fans and stuff like that. So I'm going to move on to evaluating the direct contact hypothesis and how that works or doesn't work in terms of explaining the Shroud's images. So with that, I will shut up and have a great week, everybody. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks, Dale.